They said the silence that followed the red wedding was the silence of the grave. That night would pass into legend for its cruelty, its betrayal, its blood and steel and terrible music. And yet, for all the songs that would be sung about that fateful feast, what truly happened in the deepest corners of that hall was lost and uncertain. There were rumors, as there always are, talk of an unaccounted cart slipping out of the twins in the rain, of a half-dead wolf loaded inside, that perhaps not all the caged wolves were strangled or drowned in Frey treachery. Most believed such talk was little more than the wishful rumor of northerners seeking hope. But sometimes, in the darkness of Westeros, hope has a strange way of surviving. Robb Stark awoke in a haze of pain that blurred vision and scrambled thought. The memory of the red wedding returned in flashes. The raucous hall, the sudden discordant music, crossbow bolts slicing through the air. He remembered the last words his mother cried out, her voice torn raw by grief and desperation. A vision of his own direwolf, gray wind, roaring somewhere unseen. Then ice, then darkness. He had the vague sense of being moved, carried, lifted onto something. The next moment he recalled clearly was the prick of a needle or a knife at his side, and the taste of what might have been milk of the poppy. Somewhere above him was torchlight, or starlight, or perhaps just illusions conjured by a delirious mind. When he fully regained his senses, he was lying on a rough bedroll in a meager hut that smelled of earth and wet straw. His mouth felt as though it were stuffed with dust, his tongue thick and useless, and his side ached with every shallow breath. He tried to sit, but the pain in his body roared. He heard a rustle at his side. Someone was there, a presence, gentle hands on his skin. It was a small man, older, hair more gray than brown, with kindly eyes that sparkled even in the gloom. He wore the muddy robes of a traveling septon or a hedge doctor. "Easy, my lord," the man said in a voice that wavered with relief. "Do not tear the stitches. We nearly lost you twice over." "Where? How?" Robb's tongue barely moved to form the words. He was dizzy, and his vision blurred in and out. The man pressed a wooden cup to his lips. "Drink this, slowly." The liquid tasted bitter, and Robb instinctively swallowed. It sent a burning warmth down his throat. "My name is Qyburn," the man lied casually. At least that was the name he offered, though the stammer in his voice as he gave it hinted at doubt. "I am a loyal man to the north, or was once upon a time. Enough to save one more wolf from the jaws of the Freys. But you have to keep still." Robb coughed. "My mother, my men, the Blackfish, did any—" He could not bring himself to finish the question. The older man closed his eyes as if seeking the gentlest way to deliver a mortal blow. "I do not know the full measure. I took a chance, my lord. In the chaos I found you near death. I do not know if any escaped. You were on your back, more blood outside your body than in, and your poor mother— I am sorry. Perhaps that was mercy," Robb thought, to not hear the details of how she died, or the madness in her final moments. It was horror enough to recall the look in her eyes. A hot tear slid down the side of his face. The man's expression told him to save his strength, that everything else could wait. Even so, the next days were agony for Robb Stark. He wavered in and out of consciousness while fever ravaged him. He had no sense of how long he drifted in that mud hut. The old man, whatever his true name, cared for him, forced water or broth down his throat, changed his bandages, and prayed quietly to the Seven. Robb found a quiet, bitter irony in that. He was the king in the north, or had been, and the man who saved him prayed to gods that were not his own. But perhaps, Robb thought, there were no gods at all, or if there were, they cared little for the heartbreak of mortals. At last, his fever broke one unremarkable morning. He woke with clearer eyes and a steadier sense of his body. He realized his hair was caked with sweat and that it had grown longer in his unconscious days, that his face was half covered with a matted beard. The old man gave him some stew. He managed to eat it without gagging, though his stomach cramped from the unfamiliar weight of food. When the man asked if he felt strong enough to speak, Robb nodded, testing his voice. "How did you do it?" he said, ignoring the ache in his ribs. How did you get me out of the twins without the phrase cutting you down? The man wore a conspiratorial half-smile. No one suspects a beggar, and I had a friend. We loaded you on an old cart, told the guards we had bones to deliver to the fishmonger's pile for the dogs. They never looked under the sackcloth. It struck Robb as terrifying that his life hung on the stupidity or lazy cruelty of two random fry guards. And you did all of this why? The man's mouth twitched, uncertain. A debt, perhaps. Or I saw your mother's face, and I couldn't stand the slaughter, couldn't abide the injustice. He dipped a rag in water and pressed it to Robb's forehead. The truth is, I was there to serve Walder Frye as a traveling leech or charlatan. But he's not the only old man in this land in need of something. You needed a second chance. Robb felt he lacked the words to express the swirl of anger and gratitude and guilt in his heart. Instead, he quietly let the man dab at his brow. On the evening of the same day, the man finally let Robb stand. His legs wobbled, and he discovered a deep, throbbing weakness in his left side, as though the crossbow bolt still lingered beneath his ribs. But he forced himself upright, near hissing with pain, and let the man lead him outside. The hut stood in a small clearing. Tall pine trees ringed the little patch of damp earth. A donkey was tethered nearby, nibbling at some patchy grass. A single small fire burned in a pit. "What now?" Robb asked. A moment of silence. "My lord," the man said, "I have heard rumors that Winterfell is in ruins, that your brother, Bran Stark, was killed when it was taken by Theon Greyjoy, though who knows the truth? Your half-brother Jon Snow is said to be at the wall, pledged to the Night's Watch. If you hope to gather allies or even find safety, the North is not as it was." Every word felt like a lash. The ghosts of all Robb had tried to save or avenge flickered across his mind. Ned, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. And now, with his mother and so many loyal men dead in the twins, with the North overrun by enemies, the Stark cause seemed more impossible than ever. The phrase "king in the North" felt like a cruel joke. Is the great Jon alive? The Manderlys? Or the Umbers? I do not know. The phrase said something about having appeased the Lannisters. But rumors from the south say your uncle, Edmure Tully, is in chains or newly wed to another Fry. The Blackfish is missing, last seen fleeing. As for the Umbers or Manderlys, the man shrugged. It could be they bide their time. Could be they have bent the knee. The old man's eyes showed pity. Robb did not want pity. He wanted revenge, burning, fierce revenge. But even that desire flickered. He was half a corpse without an army. Something else twisted inside his chest. Duty. The old ways. If you must kill a man, look him in the eyes. Robb's father had instilled in him the sense that honor meant doing what must be done, no matter how hopeless it seemed. But was this a sign? Had the gods spared him for some reason? Or was he a stray piece on a game board that had no place left in the match? He sank to the ground and nearly hissed from the pain in his side. The man steadied him. Robb looked to the darkening sky, uncertain. "I have nowhere to go," he admitted at last. "No home, no army, no family left to me." "You still breathe," the man said gently. "And you still have your name. Stark means something in the North. It may be battered, but it still means something. That name brought death to everyone around me." Robb closed his eyes. "My mother, my men. Grey Wind. If I'd done things differently, if I'd married the Fry girl, don't blame yourself for their treachery." Robb turned his gaze to the old man's face, searching for something to anchor him. "What would you have me do?" "Go north," the man said quietly. "Recuperate. Seek out any loyalist who might shelter you in secret. If you cannot raise an army, at least keep your name alive somewhere it might matter one day." The suggestion that he skulk in the shadows like a wounded dog made Robb's stomach churn, but he had no better plan. He could not march on the twins alone. He could not challenge the entire might of the Iron Throne with half a lung and no allies. Perhaps if he reached the wall, spoke with Jon, he could make sense of the next step. "The wall is far," Robb said, "and between here and there, half the lords in the North might want me dead. That is why you should keep your identity hidden. Wear a hood, call yourself a wanderer." The man paused, then produced a small pouch from inside his robe. He extended it to Robb. Within were a few silver stags and copper pennies. "I managed to gather what I could. It isn't much, but you'll need it to buy a new horse, perhaps. The donkey and I will travel separately. The phrase might be looking for me if they suspect what I've done. Go, my lord. Live? That is the best revenge for now. Robb felt the weight of the coins in his palm, more symbolic than valuable. He swallowed thickly, a swirl of gratitude and anger that made him want to cry out. He forced himself not to. Thank you, he said at last, trying to muster all the dignity he once carried as king in the north. I owe you my life. Use it well, the man said. They departed the next morning in different directions. Robb's entire body trembled as he pushed himself onto a half-blind horse the man had traded some favor for, an old mare with a ragged mane. Everything felt precarious, as though the world might slide away beneath his feet. In that moment, it struck him that he had not even properly learned the man's true name. But it was too late now. The older man had vanished with the donkey, turning onto a different track, leaving Robb alone. Riding was pain. Each step jostled his side, reminding him that he was half a dead man. Every now and then he had to stop and retch in the bushes, though there was little in his stomach to lose. On the second day, a cold rain began that pelted him, soaking through his stolen cloak, turning the roads to thick mud. The north had never seemed so distant. It took every ounce of will just to keep the horse moving. Dried bread became his only meal. The nights he spent hidden in ruined barns or hollowed-out trees, shaking, always expecting a fry patrol or a band of outlaws to find him and put a bolt in his skull. His sword was battered and he carried no shield. He wore no armor, only a shapeless old cloak and breeches that reeked of stale sweat and the copper tang of dried blood. His father would scarcely have recognized him. Days became weeks. The roads grew emptier. Once, Robb glimpsed a patrol of armed men, banners that might have belonged to the Boltons, and he hurried off the track into the woods. Surviving the Red Wedding had taught him caution and a certain measure of ruthlessness. He tried to hunt small game and nearly wept the day he managed to catch a hare in a snare. He ate it by a smoky fire, praying no one would see the thin trail of smoke. Strength began to return to his limbs, but the wound in his side always burned if he walked too fast or if he pulled at it in the wrong way. The scar would likely pain him for the rest of his days. Eventually, the land grew colder, the trees taller, the nights longer. He was in the north again, but it did not feel like the north of his childhood. The villages were quiet, a tension in every face he saw. Many had been burned to the ground. Homes turned to charred beams, fields to blackened stumps. Sometimes he would stumble into a hamlet and see the bodies of small folk hung from trees as a warning, carrion crows picking at the remains. He kept moving. Outside a shuttered inn, windows boarded, door battered but locked, he found a well. He drank his fill of cold water, breathing heavily from the effort of simply dismounting. There was a flicker in the corner of his eye. A child's face peered at him from behind a broken shutter. Her eyes were large with fear. By the time he turned, she was gone. He tried the door, found it barred, and knew no one inside trusted strangers. So he didn't knock. Instead, he lifted himself painfully back onto the mare and continued toward the King's Road that would take him to Castle Black. He did not know exactly what he expected to find there. Jon was sworn to the Night's Watch, and the Watch took no part in the wars of the realm. Honor and oath demanded neutrality, or so the old vow said. But Jon was his brother, or as good as one. Robb had always loved him, always felt a kinship with the boy who wore the name Snow but had the heart of a Stark. For so many years, they had wrestled in the yard, raced their direwolves, teased each other over mead. If anyone in the world might know what to do next, it would be Jon. Even if it was only a safe haven, some corner of Castle Black where Robb could rest. He was not sure the Night's Watch would allow such a thing, but the thought gave him something to hope for, and that was enough. The days dragged on. The sky turned leaden, threatening snow. Robb pulled his hood low and tried to become one with the road's endless solitude, focusing on each step of the horse, each breath he took. Past battered villages and burned fields, past travelers who gave him a wide berth or else he gave them a wide berth. He heard rumors in hushed conversations when he paused at a roadside tavern or stable. People whispered that the Boltons had taken the dread reins in the north, that Ramsay Bolton terrorized the land. The name turned Robb's stomach with revulsion. They said that Roose Bolton was named Warden of the North by the Iron Throne. That House Stark was scattered, done for. Robb learned of the siege at Riverrun, the rise of the Freys, and how Walder Frey demanded that all loyalty to the Stark cause be spurned. He even heard the whispered rumor that Arya Stark might have been seen traveling under some Lannister escort, but that seemed too ludicrous to entertain. He heard no mention of Bran, no mention of Rickon. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity of trudging, he arrived at the Gift, that sparse land beneath the shadow of the wall that was under the Watch's protection. The weather was bleaker, the wind sharper, and the sky a never-ending expanse of gray. The horse coughed and seemed ready to collapse. One more day, he told himself. One more night. Then I will see my brother. That singular notion propelled him forward as though a rope pulled him. When he finally reached the gates of Castle Black, it was near dusk. The colossal wall loomed overhead, a sheer barrier of ice, majestic and terrible. Guards with black cloaks stood outside, weapons at their sides, though they seemed less formidable than the memory of watchers in years past. Perhaps the Watch had grown thin. Perhaps the wildlings had cost them dearly. He had heard that Mance Rayder led a host. Could it be that the Watch had no men to spare for gate duty? Regardless, they noticed the traveler approach with weary disinterest. Halt, one called. State your business. Robb carefully dismounted, leaning heavily on the mare's flank for support. He kept his head down so they would not see his face too clearly. I am Robb Sta. He caught himself. How foolish to speak his name openly. I am a wanderer. I seek audience with the Lord Commander or any man named Jon Snow, if he still draws breath here. One of the guards, a tall, wiry fellow, narrowed his eyes. Jon Snow's the Lord Commander now, as it happens. Sworn in not long ago. That bit of news startled Robb so profoundly that he nearly stepped back. Jon is Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Aye. Have you come from the north or the south? Robb hesitated. I come from war. That's all you need know. He coughed into his glove to hide the rawness in his voice. Please, take me to the new Lord Commander. I have news that might concern him. The guards exchanged looks. The wiry one scratched at his stubbled chin. All right, but keep your sword sheathed or we'll put a bolt in your heart faster than you can spit. Robb nodded, biting down his impatience. They led him inside the gate, along the courtyard, where black brothers were finishing their day's work. Smoke rose from forges, and the tang of cold air bit at Robb's nostrils. Men in boiled leather and black cloaks gave him curious glances, but none stopped him. His heart pounded. Jon Snow, Lord Commander. It seemed inconceivable, but perhaps it was precisely what the realm needed. They brought him to a modest tower where a single guard posted outside nodded them through. The interior was dimly lit by lanterns. They climbed a short flight of steps to a door. The wiry brother knocked. Lord Commander, a traveler here to see you. A muffled voice from within. Enter. Robb swallowed hard. The door opened, revealing a small chamber furnished with little more than a table covered in parchments, a few chairs, and a fireplace. A dark-haired man in black stood behind the table reading by lantern light. He looked up and for a moment time twisted in Robb's mind. Jon's face was older, leaner, with deeper lines from weariness and responsibility. Yet those gray eyes were the same, that sense of quiet intensity. His hair was cropped shorter, though it still curled a bit at the collar. And across his left eye was a faint scar. But the moment he saw the traveler, Jon's expression shifted from annoyance at the interruption to shock. The other guards might have drawn their swords if they'd realized who he was. But they were as oblivious as Jon was for a second. Robb reached up, drew back his hood, and let Jon see. The effect was immediate. Jon's eyes went wide, and he let the parchment fall from his hand. He inhaled a sharp breath. Gods, he whispered. He came around the table in 3 swift steps, ignoring the watchers at the door. Robb? Robb wanted to laugh or cry or both. Instead, he forced the ghost of a smile. It's me, Jon. His voice trembled with the weight of it. If you'll still call me brother. The watchers exchanged glances of utter confusion. Jon motioned for them to leave. Close the door, he commanded. They did so, leaving the 2 men in privacy. And then Robb found himself enveloped in his half-brother's arms, Jon's breath ragged with disbelief. For a moment, neither spoke, their throats too thick with the swirl of heartbreak and relief and anger and confusion. Jon drew back, hands on Robb's shoulders as if to confirm he was real. They said you were dead. Everyone said there was a massacre at the twins, Cailin, Grey Wind, your bannermen. Robb nodded, swallowing the sob that threatened to tear free. I was. Nearly. But I lived. A friend, an ally, someone rescued me. I've been traveling in secret. I don't even know where to begin. Jon's eyes hardened, sorrow and fury colliding. Mother. Robb bowed his head. She didn't make it, nor did so many others. The Freys betrayed us. Bolton too, they say. Jon shook his head slowly, one hand clenched into a fist. I've heard rumors from the south, from the men of the Night's Watch. Roose Bolton is named Warden. The Freys hold Riverrun. And you? Gods, Robb, how are you here? Robb's throat fell tight. The swirl of questions, the memories, the grief for his mother hammered him from within. But looking upon Jon's face gave him a momentary solace, a reminder of simpler times, training in the yard, forging friendships with Theon, sharing boyish boasts. It all felt like a lifetime ago. It's a long story, Robb said quietly. But the short of it is, I have no army. I have a name that might get me killed. And I'm here because I had nowhere else to go. Jon gestured to a chair near the fire. Sit. Rest. His tone turned gentle. You look as though you haven't had a proper meal in weeks. I'll send for something. I'm not sure the watch can spare it, Robb said, though he sank into the chair with gratitude. His side ached as though it were on fire. Jon snorted. We have little, but we'll find you bread and soup at the least. He paused, then seemed to remember something that weighed heavily on his mind. Much has changed here, too. Wildlings? White Walkers. The realm is in danger, Robb, far graver than any of us realized. The Dead Walk. Robb frowned. He had heard old Nan's stories about the Long Night, the others, but never dreamed them true. I've heard rumors of whites, of a white-haired king beyond the wall. But I never thought Jon's face was grim. They're real. I've fought them. Many of the Watch have. And now the wildlings gather because they fear the dead more than they hate us. I've made alliances few here understand, but I had to. The living must stand together. Robb studied Jon's expression. He believed him, the sincerity, the haunted look in his eyes, told Robb that these were no idle tales. Then, everything I fought for, everything I lost, might be overshadowed by something even worse? Jon nodded slowly. All the petty wars, the betrayals, they won't matter if the undead swarm the realm. We have a chance if we unite. But the realm is broken. The north is under Bolton. The south is under Lannister. Hardly anyone cares what happens beyond the wall. At that, a flash of determination lit in Robb's eyes. Then we must force them to care. If the Boltons have stolen Winterfell and the Freys have stolen the Riverlands, let them at least face the threat that marches from the far north. It can't be that they ignore everything. Jon sighed, the weight of leadership etched into his face. You don't know the half of it. I've sent ravens to every lord telling them what we've seen. Most don't believe. Some respond with vague encouragement, but no men, no supplies. And some just ignore us. He paused. Roose Bolton claims to acknowledge the threat, but I don't know if he truly does or if he just pretends. He wants the power that was yours. A wave of disgust rolled through Robb. He can have the title Warden of the North for all I care. I want his head. But that is not the pressing matter if the others march. Jon gestured for Robb to wait as he crossed to the door and spoke briefly with a brother outside. Moments later, a steaming bowl of broth and a hunk of black bread arrived. Jon set it before Robb. Even the simple smell made him salivate. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had real hot food. He sopped up the broth with the bread, ignoring the sting of salt in his raw throat. Jon waited in silence, watching him eat, the swirl of unspoken thoughts heavy in the air. You saved my life once, when we were boys, Jon said quietly, a reminiscent smile tugging at his lips. I nearly drowned in that frozen pond behind the Godwood, and you dragged me out. After that, I always felt we'd look out for each other. His voice wavered. I'm glad you're not dead, Robb. Robb set the bread down. I came here to see if there was any sense left in this world. Because I have none left in me. He took a shuddering breath. Jon, the White Walkers, if they come, can we stand against them? Jon ran a hand through his hair. We have the wall. It's formidable. But it cannot stand forever if the living are divided. 100,000 wildlings are cowering somewhere beyond. The Watch has maybe a few hundred men left who can fight. The Southern Lords quibble. House Stark is all but gone. Yet you're here, and I'm here. Maybe that means we have a chance. A spark of the old, fierce pride rose in Robb. The Starks were not gone as long as one wolf lived. Then let's unite the North, Robb said. Bolton sits in Winterfell, but the great houses, Manderly, Umber, Karstark, some of them might still remember their oaths to House Stark if they learn I'm alive. If I could rally them, they would rise for you, Jon agreed, though caution flickered in his eyes. But you're wounded, and the Boltons have a stranglehold. If the Karstarks remain bitter over Lord Rickard's death and your betrothal fiasco, the Umbers might be forced to comply with Bolton or risk the horrors Ramsay can inflict. Still, some must remain loyal in their hearts. Wyman Manderly, perhaps. Robb nodded. I won't blame any for bending the knee after the Red Wedding. They were cornered or blackmailed. But if they learn I still breathe, that changes everything. Bolton's power was staked on the claim that the king in the north is dead. Jon let out a measured breath. We cannot do this alone. The Night's Watch can't help directly. We are meant to take no part in the wars of the realm. But in truth, the real war is against the dead. If it's a matter of defending the living, we may find ways to circumvent the letter of the oath. A ghost of a smile. Robb recognized the subtle glint in Jon's eye. That cunning sense of how to do the right thing, even if the rules forbade it. If we gather the north, Robb said, and you keep the wall, we might stand a chance. The first order is to secure Winterfell. The castle is a symbol. If I could retake it just long enough to rally the lords loyal to House Stark, then perhaps I can raise an army. We'd have to work quickly, though. Snow could bury any campaign soon. Jon's jaw tightened. You talk as though you're still a general, but you are a single man in hiding. I can't give you my rangers. The Watch would call it treason. Robb placed a hand on Jon's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. I don't want to drag you into a war. You have your own war to fight here at the Wall. And if what you say is true, that might be the greater war. But let me try to do my part. If the North is free, if we have men at arms who remember their old loyalty, then we can aid the Watch. March with you when the time comes. That is how we save the realm. Jon lowered his eyes as though struggling with the weight of two worlds. When Father left for King's Landing, everything changed. When he lost his head, everything changed again. Now we have come to yet another crossroad. You and I, we were once just two boys in Winterfell with a dire wolf each. Now the fate of the realm might hang on whether we can stand together. His voice had grown solemn. I cannot defy my vows as openly as giving you 100 men, but I can lend you a friend or two. There are some among the Black Brothers who might undertake a scouting mission into the north, if you understand me. Men who've come to trust my judgment. Robb exhaled, relief mingling with gratitude. I'd be thankful for any help. They spoke late into the night, huddled by the fire as the wind howled beyond the walls. Jon revealed more about the terrifying threat beyond the wall, the White Walkers, their skeletal wights, the strange swirling patterns left in their wake, the memory of Harhome, the alliances with wildlings who had once been considered mortal enemies. Robb, in turn, explained the dim details of his escape from the twins, how he'd been in hiding, healing from the mortal wounds the Freys had inflicted. He revealed how he'd heard of the Boltons' ascension in the north, of the ruin that had befallen the Riverlands, though his voice cracked when he recalled the fate of Riverrun and the Tullis. It felt like speaking of a dream, an awful, half-remembered nightmare. Yet the sight of Jon's face, the warmth of the hearth, reminded him that he still drew breath and that a new war beckoned. In the morning, Jon arranged discreet quarters for Robb in a small storeroom off the common barracks, insisting that rumors would spread if he were seen. Only a few trusted Black Brothers, men close to Jon who recognized the gravity of the situation, knew Robb's identity. Jon introduced him to one, Tormund Giantsbane, a wildling with a mane of red hair and a booming laugh, who found great amusement in the notion that the king in the north was hidden away in a dusty closet. Another was Ed Tollett, called Dolorous, who made wry remarks about the end of days and how ghosts of kings were all that remained. And there was Samwell Tarly, a soft-spoken, kind-eyed brother who clutched old tomes to his chest and seemed genuinely awestruck at meeting Robb. Robb took it all in, feeling oddly safe within the austere halls of Castle Black, as though, for the first time in many moons, he could let himself breathe. The days that followed were spent in quiet recovery and whispered plans, forging a path that might allow him to slip into the north under the Watch's watchful ignorance. Jon had selected two Black Brothers, men who were either wildlings or had no love for the Boltons, to accompany Robb on his clandestine mission. They were sworn to secrecy and told to treat Robb as a mere friend. Officially, they were traveling to the Shadow Tower or Eastwatch or some other excuse. It was all a precarious dance around the letter of Jon's command. Jon also arranged for Robb to train lightly in the practice yard, though always at odd hours and with his face covered by a half-helm. Robb discovered quickly how his injuries had slowed him, how he could no longer swing a longsword with the same ease. The first time he tried to spar, a searing pain shot through his side, doubling him over, leaving him breathless. He would need time to recover. The fear that he might never be the same swordsman he once was gnawed at him. Even so, he forced himself to push on to regain what strength he could. This mission was too vital for him to remain the broken shell he felt like. Within a fortnight, they had a plan. Robb would travel with the two black brothers and a single packhorse for supplies. They would ride first to the last river, then cut across the rugged back trails that led toward White Harbor, where rumor said Lord Wyman Manderly still held some measure of power and a secret loyalty to House Stark. If Manderly could be convinced that Robb was alive and well, and if they could muster some discreet support, they might have the beginnings of a loyal force. From there, they would move inland, seeking out any loyal lords or knights. Secrecy was paramount. If the Boltons learned too soon that Robb survived, they would snuff him out before he could rally even a handful of men. On the eve of their departure, Robb found Jon alone by the top of the wall, gazing out into the dark beyond. There was a watchful hush in the air, the cold wind biting at the cheeks. Torches flickered here and there, but the vast night was unbroken except for the glimmer of distant stars. It reminded Robb of the old times, how he and Jon would slip atop the walls of Winterfell to watch the night sky. "I'm leaving at first light," Robb said softly. "But I wanted to say goodbye properly, brother." Jon turned. The shadows danced across his face, highlighting the solemn worry in his eyes. "I wish I could ride with you, but my place is here." "I know," Robb swallowed, feeling the weight of both their burdens. "You have a war of your own. The realm doesn't even know how much it depends on you." Jon's lips quirked into a sad smile. "Same for you, Robb. If you can rally the North, if we stand united when the others come, that might be the realm's only hope." Robb nodded. "And if I can't?" Jon's gaze turned to the horizon as if searching for something in the endless darkness. "Let's not speak of that. Trust that the gods have a plan. Or, if they don't, we'll make one ourselves." Robb felt a warmth spread through his chest, a reminder of brotherly love in a world starved of kindness. "Take care of yourself. And if ever you need me, ravens fly two ways." They clasped forearms in the old style. Robb gripped tight, meeting Jon's gaze. "The White Walkers have never faced a wolf pack like ours," he said. "Ned Stark's sons still live." Jon nodded, swallowing emotion. "We do, and we will avenge your dead." The wind whipped their cloaks around them. They stood a moment longer, side by side, staring into the darkness, letting the gravity of it all settle. Then, with a heavy heart, Robb descended from the wall. Sleep claimed him only fitfully that night, as if the ghosts of his mother, Grey Wind, and all his fallen bannermen tugged at him. Dawn came all too soon, pale and cold. He joined the two black brothers in the courtyard, one a burly older man named Rory, the other a wiry youth named Kenneth, who had joined the watch after escaping some southern lord's justice, and they set forth. Jon saw them off discreetly, a simple nod and a hand upon Robb's shoulder. The gate opened. The three riders, cloaked and hooded, moved out into the brisk north. Behind them, the colossal wall loomed like a silent sentinel. Ahead lay an uncertain path. Robb felt the weight of it press upon him. He was no longer a king, not truly. He was a survivor, a wounded wolf seeking to piece together what was left of his world. Yet a spark burned in him that refused to yield. It was the same spark that had driven him to march south to avenge his father, the same spark that had bound men to him, crowned him king in the north. Even now, battered and bruised, that spark glowed. They traveled quietly through the gift at first. The farms looked half abandoned, some small folk living in fear of raids from wildlings or perhaps from Bolton's men. But the presence of black brothers occasionally brought relief to the peasants, who recognized the distinctive dark cloaks. Rory and Kenneth played that part, wearing their watch attire, openly letting Robb remain the unremarkable companion. Robb said little, merely kept his head down, hoping that no one would look too closely at his face. When they reached a fork in the road, they turned east, heading for the wooded hills that might offer them concealment. The main roads were still dangerous, with Bolton patrols rumored to roam. Robb felt the tension in his chest each time they spotted distant riders. He had to force his mind not to dwell on what would happen if he were captured. The Boltons would not give him the quick death Walder Frey nearly granted, they would do worse. He pressed on. 3 days in, the first snowfall fell, light flurries dusting the ground. The horses snorted in protest. At night, the cold pressed in, making sleep a challenge. Still, Robb felt a hardening in his resolve. He was alive. He was free of the nightmares of the twins. And each day, his side hurt less. He practiced sword drills when they stopped to rest, ignoring the exasperated looks of Rory, who worried about leaving footprints or drawing attention. Robb argued that if they did end up in a fight, he needed to be ready. Rory had no retort, merely a reluctant nod. On the 5th day, they encountered a merchant's wagon stuck in a muddy rut. The merchant wore threadbare clothing, his donkey braying in frustration. Kenneth urged them to ride on by, but Robb felt compelled to help. They dismounted and pushed the wagon free. The merchant thanked them profusely, eyes wide with gratitude. He offered them bread in exchange. Robb accepted, though he kept his hood low. The merchant prattled about how business had never been so terrible, how the Boltons taxed all trade and demanded fealty to the new warden. He spoke of the uneasy quiet in the region as if all awaited some new horror. Robb's stomach churned. Even small folk could sense the dread. They parted ways. The merchant likely had no clue that he had been aided by the rightful king in the north. The moment brought Robb no vanity, only a quiet sense of sorrow for how far his star had fallen. Yet perhaps it was better that no one recognized him, that no bards sang of him yet. Secrecy was their shield. They pressed deeper into the hills. The path grew narrow, the forest thicker. Snow gathered on pine boughs above. Occasionally, Kenneth would scout ahead, returning to report any sign of Bolton outriders or Fry men. They saw none. Either the Boltons had grown lax or they had other concerns. Perhaps they believed the threat of the White Walkers enough to keep travelers from roving too far. But tensions rose one evening when they found a campfire in a small clearing. 3 men in tattered cloaks crouched around it. There was no immediate sign of house banners, but from the glint in their eyes, Robb sensed trouble. Highwaymen, bandits, or perhaps Sells-words gone rogue. The moment they spotted Robb's trio, they stood, hands near their weapons. One called out in a raspy voice, "Ho there. Traveling so late in the day?" Kenneth, glancing at Rory, answered tersely, "We're sworn brothers of the watch. We mean no trouble." The man snorted. "No trouble unless we choose to make some. But that would be unwise." His hand drifted to the hilt of a chipped longsword. "Still, the watch has no real say this far south, do they? Might you have some coin to spare, crows?" Robb tensed, exchanging a look with Rory. The older black brother's jaw set in a hard line. "We've no coin for the likes of you," he growled. "We're on the watch's business." One of the other men circled around, eyeing them hungrily. "And who's your silent friend there? The one in the hood?" He pointed a knife at Robb. "You shy, lad?" Robb felt his chest tighten. Carefully, he let his cloak slide back enough to reveal the hilt of his sword. He knew that if these men tried anything, they'd have no mercy from him. The memory of the Red Wedding's treachery still burned hot. "I'm not shy," he said, keeping his voice level. "Just cold." The first bandit, who seemed the leader, laughed, a harsh sound. A crow, and a cold boy. You've chosen a strange path." "Likewise," Rory said. "We'll be moving on." The bandit leader's eyes narrowed. "We want what you have. Weapons, supplies. Drop it or we'll take it from your corpses." Robb's heart thumped. He wasn't certain he was up for a fight, but he had no intention of yielding. He loosened his sword in the scabbard, exchanging a glance with Rory. The older man gave a slight nod. Kenneth stepped back, slipping an arrow from his quiver. The bandits tensed. In the crackling silence of the cold forest, Robb drew his sword. The steel glimmered faintly in the firelight. It was over in seconds. The bandit who tried to rush Robb ended with steel through his belly. Rory flung himself upon the leader, driving a dagger beneath his rib. Kenneth's arrow took the last one in the neck before he could even move. Blood steamed in the cold air. Robb stood, sword in hand, breath coming in ragged gulps. The ache in his side was sharp, but he'd endured. He wiped the blade on the fallen man's cloak. They left the bodies where they fell. That night, no one slept well, though they salvaged some extra supplies the bandits had stolen. Robb found himself gazing at the sword in his hand, the reflection of the moonlight in the steel, thinking of all the men he had killed since the war began. One more body among thousands. He felt empty. The next day, they crossed a narrow pass, and on the far side, they glimpsed the outskirts of White Harbor's territory. The land seemed bleak, the farmland half-frozen. Robb's heart quickened. Lord Wyman Manderly I'd be his best chance at forging a new alliance. He recalled the boisterous lord from the days of King Robb's court, a man who had pledged fealty to the Starks many times. But a great deal had changed. They approached discreetly, traveling minor roads until they found a quiet inn on the outskirts. It was not boarded up, surprisingly. The sign out front depicted a whale with a fish in its mouth. Rory insisted they stable the horses in a wooded copse out of sight, sending Kenneth in alone first to scout. He returned with news. The innkeeper seemed old and half-blind, no sign of Bolton men. It might be safe to rest. They were battered, weary, in need of warmth, so they risked it. Inside, a single common room with a low fire offered respite from the cold. The innkeeper was indeed ancient, stooped with watery eyes. He took their coin without question, giving them a corner table near the fire, where a young girl brought a pot of stew and some weak ale. They ate in tense silence. A few other patrons huddled at tables, men who looked like traveling merchants or fishermen. None seemed to pay them much mind. Robb allowed himself a moment's rest. The stew tasted wonderful, even if it was thin and salty. The ale warmed his belly. He glanced at Rory and Kenneth. "I'll ask around tomorrow for Manderly's disposition," he murmured softly. "I need to see if I can get a message to him without betraying myself." Rory nodded. "We'll lay low." But the next morning, before Robb could set his plan in motion, the hush in the inn turned tense. Outside, hoofs thundered in the courtyard. A half-dozen mounted men in the livery of House Bolton, flayed man on pink field, arrived, demanding entry. The innkeeper rushed to greet them, trembling, gesturing them inside. They stomped in, their boots muddy with half-frozen slush. One carried a crossbow, another had an axe at his belt. Their leader, a gaunt man with a sneer etched into his features, looked around the common room. Robb and his companions were seated in a corner, hoods up, trying not to draw attention. The lead Bolton man slammed a hand on the bar. "We're searching for a runaway," he declared to the innkeeper. "A youth, dark hair, slender build, possibly traveling with black brothers. Have you seen anyone like that?" The innkeeper shook his head frantically, watery eyes wide. "No, my lord. We've had a few travelers, but no runaways." The gaunt man sneered. "We have reports of the king in the North's allies lurking about, disguised in black cloaks. Word is, the phrase suspect that the traitor Robb Stark may still draw breath somewhere in these lands." A hush descended. Robb felt his breath catch in his throat. He dared not move. Rory's jaw tightened. Kenneth's hand rested on his knee, twitching as though near his dagger. The Bolton men scanned the room. Their eyes settled on Robb's table. "You three, show yourselves." Slowly they rose. Robb kept his face half turned away, letting Rory do the talking. "We're black brothers of the Night's Watch, as you can see, traveling on official business." The gaunt man narrowed his eyes. "You've come far from the wall, black brother. What business would that be?" Rory forced a tight smile. "Lord Commander's orders. We seek out any stray recruits. Or do you dare question the Night's Watch with winter coming?" The Bolton soldiers glanced at one another. The crossbowman tightened his grip. Their leader sneered again. "We question what we like. Remove your hoods. Let me see your faces." Robb's heart hammered. He knew if they recognized him, that would be the end. He risked a quick glance around. The innkeeper was cowering. The other patrons stared in fear or confusion. He sensed that Rory and Kenneth would fight if needed. But 6 Bolton men, likely more waiting outside, it would be a bloodbath. Or they'd simply kill the innkeeper and the other patrons to make a point. Reluctantly, Rory lifted his hood, revealing a shaved head and an old scar across his cheek. Kenneth did the same, showing the youthful face beneath. The gaunt man eyed them suspiciously, then turned to Robb. Robb could do nothing but comply, so he pulled back his hood enough to reveal a face heavily shadowed by stubble and fatigue. He kept his expression as neutral as possible. "You," the man said, stepping closer, eyes searching Robb's features. "You've the look of a Northman. Some might say a Stark. Have I seen you before?" Robb's pulse pounded in his temples. His throat felt tight. He summoned his best gruff voice. "I doubt it. I'm from a village near the Shadow Tower, near the Bay of Seals. Signed up to take the Black after some trouble." His gaze flicked away as if ashamed. "I'm no Stark." The Bolton man pursed his lips, considering. Then he gave a derisive snort. Could be you're lying. But then, what would King Robb Stark be doing, skulking in and in like a frightened rat? The boy was killed at the Twins, so they say, though some claim his wraith roams. He spat on the floor. "More likely, you're just crows with fleas." He waved them off dismissively and turned back to the innkeeper. "We'll take some ale and a meal. And you'd best keep your eyes open. If you see anything suspicious, you come to us. We pay in coin, not in flayed hides." The innkeeper bobbed his head in terror, shuffling to fetch ale. Robb exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders not to tremble. That had been too close. He and his companions reclaimed their seats, though each of them felt their hearts hammering. They had no choice but to remain, feigning calm, while the Bolton men drank, ate, and boasted loudly of their warden's cunning. After a few hours, they mounted up and left, continuing on to whatever vile errands they had. As soon as they were gone, Kenneth turned to Robb, voice low. "We should move on. That was too close. They'll be scouring these lands for any hint of you." Robb nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. "Aye. We'll need a better approach. Maybe we can't walk into White Harbor with our heads high. We need a coded message or a secret sign. Something that tells Manderly I'm here. We can't do it ourselves. We'll need an intermediary." Rory frowned. "Who?" Robb thought a moment, scanning the room. The old innkeeper might be too frightened. The fisherman at the bar might be a local. But could they trust him? They had no guarantee. Then Robb remembered the merchant they had helped on the road. Perhaps that was a path lost. He could not wander randomly, hoping to find someone loyal to the Starks. That might see him hung from the nearest tree. Time was of the essence, and stealth was paramount. He stood. "We ride now," he said quietly. "I'll figure out who we can trust later. For now, we need to vanish before those Bolton curs return." They settled their meager bill with the innkeeper, who watched them go with trembling eyes. Robb gave the man a fleeting nod of thanks and stepped out into the wintry air, swirling with flakes. The sky was a flat gray. Rory and Kenneth retrieved the horses, leading them from the copse behind the inn. They mounted quickly and rode off at a steady pace, forging deeper into the territory near White Harbor. As they left, Robb glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see Bolton riders in pursuit. But the road remained silent, the snow drifting. Each step of the horses felt like a drumbeat in Robb's chest, echoing the vow he had made to himself. Survive. Gather the North. Stand against the coming night. The specter of the Red Wedding still haunted his every dream, but there was a new sense of purpose now. Jon Snow believed in him. The realm needed him, needed House Stark to stand once more. And if he had to fight every Bolton, every Frey, every Lannister to see it done, he would. The silent hush of the snow seemed to whisper an echo of his father's words, "Winter is coming." But so, too, was Robb Stark. He was no king now, only a wounded wolf. Yet a wounded wolf was still a wolf, and a wolf could still bare its teeth. If he had to become as cunning as the shadows and as fierce as the cold, so be it. He would see the North freed from Bolton tyranny, if only to keep that promise to Jon. That when the dead marched, the North would march back, united under the banner of the direwolf. Somewhere far away, perhaps Walder Frey feasted in his cursed hall, believing the Stark line extinguished. Roose Bolton might sleep in Ned Stark's own bed in Winterfell. But Robb drew his next breath and spurred his horse onward. Before this was over, they would know that the wolf still lived. And more importantly, that the wolf had teeth enough for vengeance, and for the coming war against the ice and death that loomed beyond the wall. They traveled along a winding forest track, leaving behind the immediate farmland that led to White Harbor. Robb had decided they needed to find a quiet place to lodge, away from prying eyes, before formulating a fresh plan of contact. The men said little as the hours passed, the snow continuing to drift down in gentle flurries that coated the world in silence. Thick pine and fir trees rose around them, limbs heavy with white powder. The hush was so absolute that Robb swore he could hear his own heartbeat. Occasionally, a raven cawed in the distance, echoing ominously through the pines. They made camp that night beneath an outcropping of rock, using the natural stone as a windbreak. Rory and Kenneth gathered deadwood for a small fire, though they kept it small and well-shielded. Robb accepted a share of salted meat, tearing at it with dull hunger. He felt the day's tension in every muscle. The memory of the Bolton men in the inn still rattled him. He had wanted to kill them, to avenge every Stark that had died. But that would have been suicide. He needed cunning, not blind rage. If the last year had taught him anything, it was that rash decisions could destroy entire kingdoms. He stared at the dancing flames, letting his mind drift to the scattered dreams he'd been having. Nightmares of gray wind howling in the darkness, of crossbow bolts whistling, of Catelyn Stark screaming for mercy that never came. Other times, he dreamed of the crypts beneath Winterfell, the statues of old kings of the North that seemed to watch him with hollow eyes. He dreamt of his father's statue stirring. Was it a call to arms or a call to rest? He could not say. A snap of a twig pulled him from his reverie. Kenneth emerged from the darkness, returning from a quick scout of the perimeter. "No sign of riders," the young man said softly. "But I did see footprints in the snow about a mile up the track. Might be travelers from White Harbor. Or might be something else." Robb nodded. "We'll keep watch in shifts." Rory stood, rolling his broad shoulders. "I'll take first watch. My back is too sore to sleep anyway." He cast a rueful smile. "It's the cold." With that decided, Robb and Kenneth settled down to try and rest, as best they could. Robb wrapped himself in a blanket, using his saddle as a pillow. The ground was hard, cold, but he had grown used to discomfort during his long trek from the twins. He closed his eyes. The wind made a low moaning sound through the trees, like the grieving lament of the old gods. After a time, he drifted into shallow slumber. He dreamt he was at Winterfell again. The courtyard was bathed in the soft glow of morning light, and he stood with gray wind beside him. The dire wolf seemed larger than life, towering up to Robb's chest. They gazed across the yard, watching as Ned Stark spoke with Maester Luwin. Jon, Theon, and the younger siblings darted about, playing a game of tag. Catelyn stood at the balcony, a faint smile on her lips. Robb felt warmth, security, the sense that all was right in the world. Then, in the dream, everything froze. A shadow fell over the castle. Ned looked at Robb, eyes filled with sorrow. Gray wind snarled, and blood began to seep across the stones, unstoppable, overshadowing the sunlight. Catelyn screamed, but there was no sound. Jon looked at Robb, mouthing something he couldn't hear. Then the White Walkers appeared, shattering the gates. The world was consumed in an icy darkness. Robb tried to run to his family, but his legs were trapped in place. Gray wind howled a final, mournful note that echoed until it became the shriek of a windswept blizzard. Robb bolted awake, a gasp catching in his throat. The night was still, the fire a bed of embers. Kenneth lay curled on the other side, breathing softly in sleep. Rory was perched nearby, glancing over. "Bad dream?" he asked quietly. Robb ran a hand over his face, nodding, heart still pounding. "Just the same dreams I've been having." He forced himself to sit up. "You should wake Kenneth soon. You need some rest." Rory shrugged. "I can keep going for a while yet, but sure, I'll wake him soon." He paused, then added, "You know, King, sorry, Robb. If this is too much for you, you can always hide here in the north. The Boltons can't patrol every forest." Robb stiffened. "You think I'd give up?" Rory's face was calm. "Of course not. But I wonder how you'll gather the north without starting a war you can't win." "War might be inevitable," Robb said grimly. "I have no illusions that the Boltons will step aside if I simply show up on Manderly's doorstep. But we have to try. The White Walkers are coming. If we can't unite, the realm is finished." Rory studied him with a mixture of respect and concern. "Well, you'll have me as long as the Lord Commander says so. Let's hope you can pull a few loyal houses back to your banner." He turned his gaze outward, scanning the silent trees. Robb watched the embers glow for a time, feeling the chill settle back in his bones. He knew that beyond these trees, the entire fate of Westeros might be shifting. The Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Martells, none of them had come to the North's aid. The Targaryen girl across the sea was rumored to have dragons, but that might be a bedtime story for all Robb knew. He had only the memory of his father's words, and the hope he'd seen flicker in Jon's eyes. That would have to be enough. At dawn, they resumed their journey, heading deeper into the territory that ringed White Harbor. They encountered a few fishermen with nets slung over their shoulders, trudging toward frozen ponds or streams. None seemed particularly interested in conversation. The day was clouded, the pale sun barely visible. By midday, they reached a vantage on a low ridge, from which they could see, in the far distance, the harbor itself, ships, small as toy boats, and the faint glimmer of water. Smoke rose from a cluster of buildings, marking the city. It might be a half-day's ride, if they stuck to the roads, or perhaps longer if they took back ways. Robb clenched and unclenched his fists around the reins of his horse. Just beyond those walls, Lord Wyman Manderly waited. If he still lived, if he remained loyal. Too many ifs. Yet time was slipping away. He knew that if the Boltons had a strong presence, approaching by the main gate could be suicide. But they needed a safe approach. They dismounted behind the ridge to discuss. Kenneth suggested splitting up. He would enter the city alone, carrying a letter from Robb to Manderly, but not naming Robb explicitly. "I'll just say it's from a friend," referencing the king in the north. "If Manderly is loyal, he'll get the hint." Robb weighed the plan. "And if Manderly or his men reveal you to the Boltons?" Kenneth shrugged. "I have nothing to lose. I've no family left. And I believe in you, my lord. I believe in the cause. The Watch took me in, gave me a second chance. Maybe that second chance was so I could help you." Robb felt a surge of gratitude. "Very well. But be cautious. If you sense betrayal, burn the letter and leave." Rory nodded. "Meanwhile, I'll keep watch from the outskirts. You stay hidden in the woods, Robb. We'll come find you in 3 days. If we're not back by then, go." They agreed. Robb penned a short note on a scrap of parchment, writing in a code of half-references to fish pies and old Stark sayings that only someone like Manderly, known for his love of cryptic gestures, might decipher. He sealed it with plain wax, no sigil. Then Kenneth set off on horseback, traveling light. Robb and Rory made for a secluded spot near a stand of evergreens where a narrow stream trickled. They set up a hidden camp, rationed their supplies, and waited. The hours dragged on like days. Each snap of a twig put Robb on edge, half expecting Bolton men to appear. The nights were worse, haunted by the same nightmares. On the third day, as twilight approached, Robb was pacing near the stream, running a hand through his now wild hair when Rory let out a quiet hiss. Robb whirled, hand on his sword. A shape emerged from the forest path. It was Kenneth leading his horse. But he wasn't alone. With him rode 2 men in manderly colors, a knight with a broad chest and a younger squire. Robb's heart leapt into his throat. Kenneth halted a short distance away. "My lord," he called softly. "All is well. This is Sir Marlon Manderly, nephew to Lord Wyman. He wishes to speak to you." Robb cautiously stepped forward, pulling back his hood. The older knight's eyes widened, flickering with recognition. He dismounted, bowing low. The squire mirrored him. "My lord king," said Sir Marlon softly, voice thick with emotion. "I live to serve House Stark. Lord Wyman, he can scarce believe it. We must move quickly. There are Bolton spies everywhere. But if you come with me now, we'll bring you safely to a hidden entrance into White Harbor, away from prying eyes. My lord uncle waits to greet you." Robb exhaled, relief and nerve swirling in his chest. He glanced at Rory, who nodded firmly. Then Robb stepped forward and clasped Sir Marlon's arm. "I can never repay this," Robb said. "You risk everything." Sir Marlon's eyes shone with quiet fervor. "House Manderly remembers. Always. The Lannisters and Boltons have demanded we submit, but White Harbor is no friend to them. We must tread carefully, but Lord Wyman has been waiting for a chance to set things right." And so, under cover of night, Robb Stark rode with the Manderly men, flanked by Rory and Kenneth. They took a winding route, avoiding the main roads, eventually coming upon a nondescript shack near the outskirts of the city walls. There, through a cleverly concealed tunnel, they entered White Harbor. The path was cramped and dark, the walls slick with condensation. Torchlight flickered, revealing ancient stone corridors. Eventually, they emerged within the courtyard of a Manderly keep, smaller than the main fortress. Guards loyal to Lord Wyman ushered them forward. Torchlight revealed the broad figure of Lord Wyman Manderly himself, standing beneath a stone archway supported by a cane. His triple-chin face was set in an expression of cautious hope. The moment Robb stepped into the light, Lord Wyman's eyes widened and tears threatened to spill. He sank into a deep bow, or as deep as his bulk and cane allowed. "My lord king," he said, voice trembling. "The North remembers." Robb, exhausted and overwhelmed, could only manage a faint smile. "So the wolves live," he murmured. "And we can yet return." In that moment, hope burned bright. For all the horrors left in the wake of the Red Wedding, for all the betrayals and heartbreak, Robb Stark saw a path opening before him. The first steps of uniting the North. He had no illusions that it would be easy or bloodless. But with men like Wyman Manderly at his side and Jon Snow guarding the wall, the winds of winter might yet find the living united. Even as the shadows of the White Walkers loomed closer, the battered wolf refused to yield. He would gather his strength, gather his bannermen, and bare his teeth at the darkness. And if the darkness roared back, Well, the wolves of Winterfell had faced the night before, and they would do so again. He took Wyman Manderly's hand, feeling the calluses and warmth of a loyal lord who had waited long for the return of the Starks. "My lord," Robb said, voice steady despite the tumult in his heart. "With your help, let us show the Boltons that House Stark still stands, and let us show the realm that the North will never kneel to the dead or the living who betray us." A great hush fell, and then Manderly knelt again, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My king in the North," he breathed. "We stand ready." And so the tide began to shift, quietly, secretly, under the cloak of night. The battered king had survived the treachery meant to end his line. And now, with allies old and new, he would face not only the traitors who usurped his birthright, but the ancient terror stirring beyond the wall. It was not the song of ice and fire that any bard had expected, but it was the one that would shape all their destinies. And in that hush of the White Harbor courtyard, as the snow drifted from the night sky, Robb Stark felt a new kind of resolve take hold, fierce, unyielding, like the heart of winter itself. He had come to face the dead, and to remind the living that the wolves of House Stark would never be silenced, not while a single breath remained in his lungs. Winter was coming, but so too was the retribution and redemption of the North, bound in blood and honor, in heartbreak and hope, united under the memory of Ned Stark, under the vow he and Jon had shared beneath that frozen sky, that they would not fail the living. And so the story began anew, with a wounded wolf and a solemn crow, forging a legacy that might save Westeros from the endless night. Lord Wyman Manderly's men led Robb through a small courtyard to an antechamber that smelled of burning oak and tallow candles. Servants hurried back and forth, their eyes darting uncertainly at the hooded newcomers. They all knew some clandestine arrival had occurred, but few realized the weight of that secret, the king in the North alive after the Red Wedding. Rory and Kennett kept close to Robb, neither touching their weapons but clearly prepared to defend him if so much as a whisper of betrayal arose. Ser Marlon escorted them with a hurried stride, glancing back every few paces as though expecting Bolton men to materialize from the gloom. They passed through a narrow corridor lined with tapestries depicting White Harbor's maritime glories, a fleet of ships, each sail embroidered with the merman of House Manderly. Even in this anxious hush, Robb admired the details, remembering how the Manderlys had boasted that White Harbor's shipyards were unrivaled in the North. The corridor ended at thick double doors. Ser Marlon paused only long enough for two guards in merman livery cloaks to pull them open, and then Robb stepped into a modest hall. A single high-backed chair dominated the center of the room. In it sat Lord Wyman Manderly. He was a large man, heavy of body, his white hair combed neatly. He used a cane, but he pressed himself upright as Robb entered. At his side stood a much younger man, another nephew, perhaps, or some distant cousin, along with several guards sworn to House Manderly. The lord's bright blue eyes shone with barely contained emotion. "Come closer, my lord," Wyman murmured, voice thick, beckoning Robb to him with one hand. "Let me see you well in the light. My old eyes dare not trust rumor alone." Robb nodded. He stepped forward and lifted away the hood that concealed his face. Candlelight illuminated the tired lines around his eyes, the deep bruise-like shadows of exhaustion beneath them, the stubble that had grown unchecked in his weeks of travel. Lord Wyman drew a sharp breath. For a moment he simply gazed at Robb, tears glimmering in his eyes. "It is you," he said at last, pressing a hand against his heart. "Robb Stark, the king in the North. By the gods, we prayed that you might have escaped that nightmare at the Twins, but we never truly believed. And yet here you stand." Robb swallowed hard. The wave of grief and gratitude that rose within him felt almost overwhelming. He remembered the last time he had seen Wyman Manderly, back when the war seemed winnable, when northern lords had answered the call to arms. So many of them were dead now. "My lord," Robb managed, his voice quieter than he intended. "I am no king, not anymore. I'm just a man who survived and who needs your help." Wyman squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then nodded gravely. "Aye, you will have it. All that White Harbor can spare. But I warn you, the Boltons have embedded spies everywhere. Roose Bolton has been named Warden of the North by the Iron Throne. The Lannisters are eager to see the North subdued. We have parleyed carefully, feigning submission. We behave as if we hate your memory while we slip them half-truths and keep what independence we can. It's a perilous game, and our people suffer." Robb's jaw clenched. "I know. I would not ask you to risk the lives of your people lightly. But if we do nothing, Bolton and Fry hold the North forever. The White Walkers will come. Those nightmares from beyond the wall are not just stories. My brother John has told me what he's seen. Winter is coming in truth, and if we're divided, we'll all die. Wyman nodded again. We have heard rumors from the wall of whites and worse. Many say it's wildling gossip, but I have old letters from Maester Lewin in Winterfell speaking of ill omens in the far north. I do not doubt your word. But you must know Lord Bolton claims to be ready for any threat from beyond the wall. He preaches loyalty to the realm, but you and I both see the lie. He's more concerned with solidifying his control. Wyman's face twisted in disgust. He has let his bastard son, Ramsay, terrorize half the north. Folk vanish in the night, villages burned if they so much as whisper your name. Robb's chest churned with rage. Memories of that smirking face, Ramsay Snow, rumored to be the most sadistic wretch in the land, flickered through Robb's mind. He knew rumors of how Theon Greyjoy had been captured, of how Ramsay flayed men for sport. That demon will see the north bled dry, Robb said, forcing a measure of calm into his tone. We must act. The Boltons will not stop until any opposition is crushed. I come to you first because House Manderly has always been loyal to House Stark, but we need others. The Umbers, the Glovers, the Serwins, even the Karstarks, though I fear they're less inclined. I must rally them quietly if possible. When the time is right, we'll strike. One of Wyman's guards stirred uneasily. The Umbers may be under close watch, he ventured. Lord Greyjoy was captured at the Twins, so it's his kin who rule. They might be forced to kneel to Bolton or watch the Greyjoy die. Robb's stomach twisted at the reminder. The Greyjoy, one of his fiercest supporters, locked away by Frey or Lannister or both. He tried not to show the burst of grief that threatened. Then we appeal to the Umbers' sense of honor. Or we free their lord if there's a chance for that. Rory and Kenneth stood just behind Robb, silent but watchful, letting him speak freely with Lord Wyman. At last, Wyman sighed. The city is yours, though we must keep your presence a secret. Even the whisper that Robb Stark breathes might draw Bolton's entire host. For now, stay hidden in my secondary quarters. These old walls have concealed more than one fugitive in their time. We'll arrange secret meetings with lords we trust. Perhaps we can gather them here under the guise of a trade negotiation. Let them see you with their own eyes. Once you have enough support, well, the North remembers. His voice dropped to a hushed reverence as though he spoke a sacred vow. Robb met his gaze, feeling the stirrings of pride and hope. The North remembers, and we will see justice done. For my mother, for my men, for all who fell at the Twins. Wyman's eyes glistened. Then he gestured for a servant. Bring them food and warm baths, fresh clothes. We will talk details on the morrow. Let it be known to my household that no one is to speak of our guests. Say only that they are special envoys from the Night's Watch. If any ask questions, they'll be told it's about shipments of grain and fish for the wall. Robb bowed his head in thanks. You are as generous as you are loyal. I won't forget it. Not long after, Robb and his companions were led through more corridors, eventually reaching a set of hidden apartments near the back of the keep. The ceilings were low, the passages narrow, but the rooms were surprisingly comfortable. A small hearth, 2 straw-stuffed mattresses, a heavy wooden table. Servants arrived with steaming water for a bath. Robb scarcely knew what to do first, feast on the bread and roast fish they'd brought, or fall into the tub. He felt as though he had lived a lifetime in the wilderness, half dead from the wound in his side. Rory and Kenneth respectfully let him wash first. He stripped off his filthy cloak and breeches, wincing at the stiff ache in his half-healed muscles. The tub was far too small for a proper soak, but the hot water and soap felt like a gift from the gods. He scrubbed away weeks of travel grime, letting the steam loosen knots in his shoulders. The pain in his side flared, but it was a familiar companion by now. Each day the ache was a bit less, and he told himself he was stronger for surviving it. At last, he emerged, dried off, and donned a set of simple clothes that a servant had left folded on the bed, a gray wool tunic, dark trousers, a sturdy cloak that smelled faintly of cedar. He felt strange, like a different man, or like a traveler who had finally found shelter after a storm. Rory took his turn with the water next, while Kenneth devoured most of the bread. Robb couldn't help but chuckle at the boy's hunger. After they'd settled, the 3 of them sat around the table, quietly eating roast fish, peas and butter, and fresh bread. Robb closed his eyes with the first bite, savoring the flavor. It was the first hot meal he'd had since Castle Black. They talked in low voices of the next steps. Rory stressed the need for watchers and caution. Kenneth looked eager to help, but admitted his nerves were frayed. Robb, for once, let the warmth of food and the promise of tomorrow's plans settle his spirit. There would be plenty of time to brood on their dangers. That night, though the bed was small and straw-filled, Robb slept deeper than he had in months. His dreams were still tinged with shadow. Caitlin's last scream, gray winds roar, but they felt more distant. When he woke at dawn, the light filtering through the narrow window slit, he experienced a moment of disorientation, unsure where he was. Then he recalled White Harbor, Lord Wyman, the vow to reclaim the North. The memory steeled him like a well-tempered blade. He dressed in the new clothes, buckled on his sword belt, and left the hidden chambers, Rory trailing him like a silent guard. Kenneth had gone to speak with some of the manderly men about more supplies. They navigated the narrow corridors until they found a small dining hall, where they were told Lord Wyman would receive them. The hall was modest by the standards of a great keep, though still grander than anything Robb had seen in weeks. A thick table of polished oak dominated the center. 2 bright windows let in the morning light. Lord Wyman was already there, sipping from a mug of hot spiced wine, as was Ser Marlin and a few trusted knights. Bowls of porridge, slices of bacon, and loaves of coarse bread covered the table. "Sit," Wyman said, rising to greet Robb with a respectful nod. "Eat your fill. We have much to discuss." Robb took a seat near the lord, nodding to the others in greeting, though he noted how carefully they studied him, as if memorizing each line of his face. Likely they still could not believe the rumors of his survival. He helped himself to some bread and bacon, but the tension in the air kept him from fully relaxing. When everyone had plates, Wyman waved for a servant to stand watch at the door, ensuring they were not disturbed. "We have reached out quietly to certain lords," Wyman said without preamble, voice hushed. "The Glovers, through a merchant contact, have indicated interest. Lord Robert Glover, we believe, harbors deep resentment against the Boltons, though he feigns compliance. We've also tested the waters with Lady Midge Mormont on Bear Island. She is not one to bend easily, especially not to flayed men." Robb felt a faint warmth of relief. Midge Mormont had been loyal before, and House Mormont had fiercely supported the Starks. "Good. We'll gather them, one by one. The Umbers are trickier, given the Greyjoy's captivity." "True," Wyman conceded. "We might attempt to contact the smaller houses, Tallheart, Flint, Serwyn. Some are decimated by the war. We'd need to supply them arms or grain to entice their support." Robb set down his mug. "I'll do whatever it takes. We do not need a grand host to start, only enough loyal men to retake key strongholds and hold them until the rest rally. Winterfell is in Bolton hands, is it not? Have you heard any news about the castle's condition?" Wyman's expression darkened. "I know only that it's half ruined. Ramsay torched it after Theon Greyjoy's occupation. The Boltons attempt repairs, but the place is haunted by the memory of Ned Stark. Many superstitions swirl that the direwolf ghosts roam the corridors. Few wish to stay within those blackened walls, but Roose and Ramsay hold it nonetheless." The mention of Theon Greyjoy was like a knife twist in Robb's mind, stirring complicated emotions. Theon had once been a friend and ward at Winterfell, then betrayed them by taking the castle. Yet Theon had suffered unspeakable torments under Ramsay. There were rumors that he was still a prisoner, broken and maimed, but Robb had no way of knowing the truth. He forced himself not to linger on it. "When the time comes," he said, voice steel-edged, "we'll take Winterfell back. Bolton can claim all the Lannister support he wants. The North is ours by blood and right." Ser Marlin nodded, finishing a mouthful of porridge. "We have men to call upon, men who detest the Boltons, but we must act carefully. If word reaches them that you're here, they might march on us before we're ready." Lord Wyman leaned forward. "In 2 days' time, we expect a small retinue from House Glover to arrive under the guise of trade negotiations for harbor fees. We can reveal you to them then, discreetly. If they pledge their men, that might be enough for a starting strike. And if we can garner Mormont support, that's more. We'll need to pick a moment to raise our banners. Robb, once we show open rebellion, we cannot turn back." Robb's heart pounded. Once again, it felt like the day he had first been declared king in the North. All the old excitement and dread mingled in his blood. "I understand. We wait for the right moment. I'll speak to the Glovers, or whomever they send, personally. And if they demand proof that I am who I claim—" Wyman offered a sad smile. "I think your face is proof enough. Your father's eyes are in your own. But if they demand more, I'll swear by all the old gods. They settled into logistics, numbers, possible supply caches, how to outmaneuver the Bolton's watchers. Much of it was guesswork. The war and the occupation had ravaged the land. Many lords were displaced or dead. Bannermen who had once served House Stark might be forced to hide. Still, there were pockets of resistance. Wyman believed that if Robb could secure even a small victory, perhaps capturing Ramsay or liberating a lesser stronghold, it might inspire the rest. Symbols mattered, as Ned Stark had always taught them. As morning edged toward midday, they concluded. Robb promised to remain hidden in Manderly's keep until the Glover men arrived. Wyman would handle the outward facade of normalcy. Before leaving, the portly lord rose to his feet with surprising grace, caught Robb's hand in both of his own, and whispered, "It does my heart good to see a Stark among us again. My life for yours, sire. I mean that." Robb felt tears threaten. "I'm no king, my lord, just a son of Ned Stark. But I will honor your faith in me." Wyman inclined his head, and with that, the meeting ended. Robb spent the next 2 days in a restless haze, trying not to pace the rooms they were confined to. Rory and Kenneth occasionally ventured out under the pretense of scouting the harbor or assisting with Night's Watch matters. They returned with small news. No sign of Bolton patrols in the streets, but vigilance was wise. White Harbor itself bustled with merchants, some from Bravos or Pentos, who came for trade in wool, furs, salted fish, and silver. But the watchers among them might carry word to the Boltons if anything seemed amiss. Robb kept himself sharp by practicing sword forms in a walled garden behind the keep. Thick winter ivy curled along the walls. A powder of snow crusted the ground. Manderly guards discreetly kept watch, ensuring no one spied on the man training with a long sword. Robb's wound still limited him, but his old skill began to return, the sword swinging with more precision day by day. The clang of steel against the training post felt reassuring, a reminder of the strength he once commanded. Still, he wondered how he would fare in a real duel now. His father's voice echoed in memory. "We must train as we fight, or else we die unprepared." On the evening of the second day, word came that a Glover retinue had arrived, 10 men led by Galbart Glover himself, a seasoned warrior whose family had suffered greatly in the War of the Five Kings. Word also said that a pair of Fry observers had crept into town just after them, supposedly traveling south. Suspicion tightened every guard in Manderly's keep. If the Freys sensed anything, trouble could descend swiftly. But Lord Wyman insisted on forging ahead. In the hush of a candlelit solar, Lord Galbart Glover stood before Lord Wyman and 2 of Manderly's knights, ready to speak of harbor trade. But before Glover could begin his rehearsed pleasantries, Wyman simply motioned for the guards to seal the room, then turned to Glover with an intensity that brooked no evasion. "Galbart," he said, voice trembling, "House Manderly has sheltered a most unexpected guest. One who bears the blood of House Stark." Glover's expression hardened. "Wyman, if you're playing some game, no game," Wyman said. "He is alive." And with that, Robb stepped from the shadows near the fireplace, pulling back his hood. He felt Glover's startled gaze roam his features. Galbart's lips parted in shock, the color draining from his cheeks. For a moment, he looked as if he might fall. Then recognition flared in his eyes. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "Your Grace," he breathed. "How can this be?" Robb lifted him up gently by the shoulder. "I nearly died at the Twins, but fate spared me. I've been in hiding, gathering strength. The Boltons and Freys have torn the North apart, and I cannot let it stand." Galbart's throat worked, words momentarily failing him. "At last," he managed, "my lord, my king, if you only knew how your mother's death broke us. How the Red Wedding ended our cause. Some of us never believed it could truly be over, but we had no one to rally behind. You were gone. Ned was gone. Everything was lost." He swallowed, tears gleaming in his eyes. "I served your father, Eddard Stark. I knelt to you as king in the North. If you say we can rise again, House Glover will be the Fi. RST to answer. I have men hidden in the Wolfswood, scattered in small groups. We pretend to obey the Boltons, but we wait for the day of retribution." Robb grasped Galbart's hand. "Then that day draws near. We must be cunning. If the Boltons suspect you, your people will suffer. But I need loyal swords. The Umbers, the Mormonts, the Flints, any who might join us." Galbart nodded vehemently. "You shall have them, or at least a chance to speak with them." I can send riders with coded messages. We'll say it is about the harbor's increased tariffs or some other trade nonsense. Those lords who still cling to hope will come." Lord Wyman Manderly's heavy voice rumbled in approval. "We gather them here in White Harbor. But quietly, carefully. Every soul who sees you alive is another soul who must keep its secret from the Boltons. It takes only one spy to ruin us." Galbart's eyebrows lifted. "Then perhaps we bring them in small numbers at staggered times. If we claim some negotiation, winter preparations, maybe we can hide it from wandering eyes." Robb's mind raced. "Yes. We have little time before winter closes the roads. If we cannot muster enough men soon, the snows will trap us all behind city walls. But at least that means Bolton's men cannot march swiftly either. If we succeed in retaking Winterfell before the snows grow too thick, we'll hold it until spring, and the rest of the north will have no choice but to rally." Galbart's features twisted with determination. "Count on me to summon our scattered lords. I'll not rest until we right the wrongs done at the Twins." They continued, forging a plan. Glover would return to his seat under the guise of having concluded harbor negotiations. From there, he would dispatch ravens to discrete points, using code words known to the Manderlys and others who had once served Ned Stark. Names were chosen for potential gatherings. Midge Mormont was a priority, as was Lady Barbary Dustin, though that one was uncertain. The Dustins had their own grievances with the Starks, but rumor said they disliked the Boltons even more. Lords Flint, Serwyn, and Tall Heart would also receive messages. In time, others might be approached, though the Karstarks remained questionable since the death of Rickard Karstark at Robb's command during the war. There was old bitterness there. Still, no house in the north had reason to love the Boltons, and that might overcome old grudges. Before Galbart departed, Robb embraced him. "The day you bring your men to my side," he said, voice low, "will be a day I never forget. We do this for all we lost." Galbart bowed once more. "For the north," he whispered, and then he was gone, escorted out through secret corridors to the city gates. In the days that followed, White Harbor became a quiet crucible of conspiracy. One by one, small retinues bearing the devices of lesser northern houses arrived to discuss trade and winter provisions. Most came with no more than 5 or 6 men to avoid suspicion. Each time, Robb met them in the hidden solar, revealed himself, and listened as awe and hope rippled across their faces. Some wept openly, some stared in stunned silence, some bowed, muttering prayers to the old gods. And each time, Robb repeated the same vow: the North would stand again, but first they must act with caution. Not all who came pledged themselves wholeheartedly. One of Lord Serwyn's cousins expressed grave doubts, pointing out that Bolton and Lannister might descend on White Harbor with overwhelming force if they discovered this rebellion. Another lord from a smaller branch of House Flint eyed Robb suspiciously, demanding proof beyond a face. Robb recounted old stories from Winterfell, naming hunts and feasts where they had all once gathered. Then he unclasped a small amulet from around his neck, one that had belonged to Eddard Stark before passing to Robb. The man stared, recognized it, and fell to his knee, tears streaking his cheeks. That was enough. By the end of their meeting, he agreed to muster as many men as possible when the call was sounded. Yet as each success buoyed Robb's spirits, a sense of dread grew. Bolton's web of spies was not mere rumor. As more lords slipped into White Harbor, the risk of discovery rose. Lord Wyman insisted they vary the meeting hours and keep the visitors hidden. The days and nights blurred. Robb rarely went outside except under cover of darkness to pace in the courtyard or practice with Rory. He felt the heavy cloak of secrecy weigh on him, stoking the ache in his side. Even so, hope flared in each clandestine pledge. Bit by bit, a mosaic of resistance formed. Then, late on a moonless night, a rider arrived in haste at the back gate, a Mormont man bearing a letter stamped with the sigil of the bear. He was admitted into the keep, clearly exhausted from a long journey. Lord Wyman roused Robb from a half-sleep in his chamber, summoning him to read the letter at once. Kenneth and Rory rose too, blades in hand, fearful of trouble. But Wyman's manner, though urgent, was not panicked. In the flickering candlelight of that same solar, Robb took the parchment from the Mormont messenger's trembling hands. His cloak rustled about his shoulders as he scanned the spidery script, the green wax seal bearing the imprint of a bear's paw. The letter was from Lady Midge Mormont herself, to the one who would claim the Stark name. "If you are truly Robb Stark, my loyalty is yours." House Mormont never forgot its oath. "But the snows deepen on Bear Island, and my daughters and I cannot easily travel. We have fighters enough to cause the Boltons grief, but not to storm Winterfell. We will come if summoned, but be warned, your enemies grow bold. Word travels faster than you think. If you are not Robb Stark, then this is a cruel jest, and we shall find you." But if you are, you have our hearts. The North remembers. Mij Mormont Robb exhaled, relief washing through him. He lifted his gaze to meet Wyman's. She believes. And she stands with us. Wyman smiled broadly. Excellent. That old she-bear is worth 10 times her number in lesser men. But she speaks true about the snows. If winter thickens, her path south is nigh impossible. Robb nodded. We may have to do without direct Mormont troops at the outset, but we can trust they'll harass the Boltons from the west if need be. Every distraction helps. The Mormont messenger sank wearily onto a bench. Lady Mij says a new wave of snow is expected within a fortnight, possibly earlier. If you intend to strike, you must do so soon, before the passes become impassable. Robb rubbed at the scar near his ribs, feeling the dull throb that often revisited him when he was stressed. We aren't strong enough yet. We need the Umbers or the Karstarks, some larger force. Manderly's men alone number enough to hold White Harbor, but not enough to storm Winterfell. House Glover offers some, but we remain outmatched if the Boltons rally all their bannermen. He looked to Wyman in question. The older lord drew a measured breath. We have approached the Umbers discreetly. Thus far, no direct reply. They're either too closely watched or too afraid to risk a raven. I've heard rumors that the Karstarks are fracturing from within. After Lord Ricard's execution by your hand, some of them hold a grudge. But I believe the young Lord Harrion Karstark might be open to reason if we can speak to him, or if we can exploit his hatred for the Boltons. Robb pressed his lips together, remembering the day he had sentenced Ricard Karstark to death for murdering 2 Lannister prisoners. It had been an act of honor or necessity, yet it had cost him the Karstark support at a crucial juncture. If it must be done, I will ride to Carhold myself, Robb said quietly. But that's the opposite direction from Winterfell, and we have little time. Perhaps we can coax Harrion here instead. We can remind him that the Boltons stabbed the Starks in the back at the twins. Perhaps that common hatred will be enough. Wyman mulled it over, stroking his ample chin. I can send an urgent message by a courier we trust. But if Harrion Karstark refuses to come, we may have to consider moving forward without them. Robb closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Too many moving pieces. He needed at least one major ally with enough men to tip the scales. The Umbers or Karstarks were prime candidates. Otherwise, he'd have to gamble that Manderly, Glover, and the smaller houses could rally quickly. Send the courier, he said at last. Make it clear that time is short. He either helps us, or he dooms the North to Bolton rule. So, while messages flew out in all directions, Robb and his hidden allies waited, bracing for a response. Meanwhile, the city carried on with its daily rhythms. Fishermen unloaded their catches at the docks. Merchants in the markets hawked their salted cod, their carved ivory trinkets, their bales of winter wool. Lord Wyman continued receiving visitors, some truly there for trade, others to pledge quiet fealty. Robb tried to keep his mind busy by drilling with sword or attending hush-hush strategy sessions. He felt more certain each day that they were nearing the moment of truth. But with that certainty came fear, too. If one slip of the tongue betrayed him to the Boltons, all would be undone in a stroke. His anxiety reached a fever pitch one raw morning when alarms echoed through the courtyard. Shouts reverberated off the stone walls, and from the window of his hidden chamber, Robb saw men rushing with crossbows. He snatched up his sword belt, threw on his cloak, and hurried to find Wyman. Rory and Kennet were at his heels, both grim-faced. The Manderly guards, upon seeing Robb's face, quickly ushered him into a side corridor so that he would not be openly spotted, but they provided hurried explanations. A band of riders bearing the Bolton sigil had approached White Harbor's gates unannounced. No one knew their purpose, perhaps a routine check, perhaps suspicion. The city guard was letting them in as refusal would draw more suspicion. Lord Wyman, feigning calm, had gone to receive them in the main hall. The watchers had sounded the alarm to get everyone else prepared. Robb stifled a curse. Bolton's men here, they must suspect something. Why else would they come unannounced? He glanced at Rory. If they search the keep, they might find me. Rory's grip tightened on his sword hilt. We won't let them. But we should hide or flee. If they see you, stay calm, Kenneth said quietly, though his young face was taut with tension. Bolton's men might be here on some other matter. Let's not reveal ourselves unless we must. Lord Wyman will handle them. Robb drew a slow breath, pushing down the roiling dread. We hide. He motioned for the manderly guard to lead them deeper into the labyrinth of corridors beneath the keep. Quick steps echoed against damp stone as they descended a small stairwell. Candles burned at intervals, casting wavery light on the walls. At last, the guard ushered them into a cramped storeroom behind a heavy wooden door. Barrels of salted fish and casks of ale lined the walls, the air thick with brine. Robb could hardly stand upright without brushing the low ceiling. The guard lit a lantern and whispered that he would stand watch outside. If Bolton men came this far, he would try to misdirect them. So Robb waited, leaning against a barrel, trying not to breathe too loudly. Rory and Kenneth stood near him, weapons drawn. The hush was oppressively heavy. Time stretched. He wondered if Lord Wyman was in mortal peril, forced to feign hospitality to men who had slaughtered northern peasants for smaller suspicions. Roose Bolton was cunning, but Ramsay was mad. Could these be Ramsay's men? His imagination conjured horrors. The keep being stormed, Wyman taken hostage, the casks around them set aflame. He had to force himself to remain still. At last, after what felt like hours but might have been only half of one, there was a soft rapping on the door. The manderly guard cracked it open, letting candlelight spill in. His face was pale but relieved. They've gone, he whispered. It seems they came to question Lord Wyman about missing taxes from some outlying villages. They threatened an inspection, but he bribed them with silver, wine, and a grand feast next month. They left with no search. My lord, you're safe. Robb's exhale came shuddering out of him, tension draining. Rory and Kenneth exchanged looks of sheer relief. They emerged from the storeroom and climbed back to the upper corridors, hearts still hammering. Outside, the courtyard was gradually returning to normal, though a faint sense of alarm lingered in the eyes of the guards. Lord Wyman was found in a small side hall, leaning heavily on his cane, clearly rattled. Robb, he murmured, wiping sweat from his brow. That was closer than I'd like. They suspect something, or at least they're searching for reasons to torment the city. We must move swiftly. We cannot have more visits like this. Robb nodded, his mind racing. Then we raise our banners soon. We can't wait for every last house to come around. Perhaps in another week or less we strike the first blow. Wyman's expression turned grim. So be it. I will gather the lords who have pledged. We decide on a plan of action, Winterfell or some other target. Then we pray the rest will join once we show strength. He coughed. There's one more thing. A raven arrived from Carhold. Lord Harrion Karstark sends word he refuses to come to White Harbor. He doesn't trust us. He suggests if the man claiming to be Robb Stark wants his aid, he must prove he's truly a Stark by leading an army against the Boltons. Only if that victory is won, says Harrion, will he add his men. Robb felt a wave of anger, but it mingled with regret. The Karstarks had once been among his staunchest supporters. He demands I risk a fight before he commits, Robb muttered. So be it. Let him stew. We'll do this without him if we must. The next day, in a secluded hall with the now gathered representatives of Glover, Serwyn, and various smaller houses, Robb Stark made the fateful announcement they would move in a week's time. They would not march with horns and banners, not at first. Instead, small forces from each house would converge near the Wolfswood where they could hide among the trees. Once assembled, they would cut across to Moat Cailin, which was lightly held, or so rumor said. If they captured Moat Cailin, it would bar Bolton reinforcements from the south. Then they would pivot northward for a bold move toward Winterfell. With luck, they would either catch Ramsay unprepared or force the Boltons to flee. If Bolton mustered an army, Robb's men would entrench themselves within Winterfell's walls and call for the rest of the north to rise. It was a gamble. The risk that Bolton men might intercept them on the road or that Roose might converge from another direction was large. But the alternative, waiting passively in White Harbor, was no alternative at all. Galbart Glover, who had returned in secret, pointed to a map spread on the table. My men can slip along the forest trails, avoiding the main roads. Manderly's men will come from the east. The Serwyn contingent can approach from near the marshes, bridging the deeper streams. If we all keep to the timetables, we'll converge in 5 days from now. Then 2 days more to reach Moat Cailin. A few lords looked uneasy, but none voiced dissent. The moment for caution had passed. Robb's eyes swept the chamber, lingering on each face. I will lead from the front, he said quietly. I know I'm not the same man who marched south with an army. But I will bleed with you if I must, to free the north of this filth. The Red Wedding was a crime that demands redress. He saw nods around the table, though sorrow flickered in many eyes. They remembered that wedding, the betrayal, the countless losses. The mention of it now braced them like a cold wind. Wyman, presiding over the meeting, rested a heavy hand on Robb's shoulder. Then let it be done. The North fights for the North. They dispersed to prepare, each group leaving White Harbor in small increments over the next day. To avoid rousing suspicion, some left by boat, others by land at night, others in broad daylight but in pairs or trios, disguised as traders or huntsmen. Rory and Kenneth departed with a small vanguard, carrying the manderly banner but wearing the black of the watch. They would slip ahead to scout the roads. Robb lingered in the keep, finalizing details with Wyman until the last moment. At last, the day came for Robb himself to depart. Wyman met him at dawn in the courtyard, where 24 men, all carefully chosen, waited with horses. A crisp bite lingered in the air, the sky streaked with pinkish gray. Robb wore plain armor beneath a thick cloak, no regal sigils on display. He carried a stout long sword and a short dagger, and he prayed they would be enough. Lord Wyman, flanked by his knights, bowed his head. I will follow with the main manderly contingent tomorrow. The fewer riding in one party, the better. Go swiftly and safely, and if the gods are kind, the next time we meet will be on the field, victorious. Robb clasped his arm. I owe you more than I can say, my lord. If we succeed, it will be because of your bravery. If we fail, then we die as men who tried. Wyman finished, a tight smile on his lips. But let us not speak of failure. They shared a final nod. Then Robb swung into the saddle of a brown courser. The gates opened, revealing the main street of White Harbor. He led his small escort out at a steady pace, merging with the morning traffic of traders and fishermen. No fanfare, no cheers, only hush and worry. The townsfolk might guess these were some of Manderly's riders, or at most a troop heading to settle some distant matter. They could not have known that the man at the head was the last hope of House Stark, unless they glimpsed the glimmer in his eyes, the stoic determination etched in his face. They traveled north, hugging the coastline at first, then turning inland after crossing a narrow river. Every step felt like a risk, but their group was small enough to pass unnoticed, especially since so many travelers roamed the roads before winter truly set in. Kenneth and Rory rejoined them on the second day, appearing from a copse of trees with news of no large Bolton patrols in the vicinity. That came as a relief, though they remained vigilant. Twice they spotted small knots of riders in the distance, but each time they diverted into the woods until the threat passed. On the third day they approached the Wolfswood. Towering pines and oaks stretched on for miles, their leaves mostly fallen or turned a rusty color, the ground beneath a patchwork of brown needles. The gloom beneath the branches provided good cover, though it also harbored outlaws and wolves. Galbart Glover was the first to meet them at a hidden clearing. He greeted Robb quietly and reported that several other factions had already arrived, though not all. In the hush of that vast forest, Robb Stark beheld the first hint of an army that might free the North. Not 1,000 men, not even 500, but near 300 so far, all loyal, all sworn to secrecy. They made camp that night in the heart of the Wolfswood. The men huddled around small, carefully shielded fires. Robb walked among them, greeting each group. Many recognized him at once from his time as king in the north. Some had tears in their eyes. Others stared as if seeing a ghost. He clasped arms and offered words of thanks. A few showed him old wounds from the war, others recounted how their families had been scattered. The sorrow and anger of the North brimmed in each conversation. No one had forgotten what the Freys and Boltons had done. Their loyalty to House Stark burned as fiercely as ever. By the next morning, more banners trickled in. Serwyn men wearing battered armor, a sprinkling of tall men from House Tallheart, a proud group from House Flint, even a handful from House Ryswell, though the Ryswells were known to be close to the Dustons. Evidently, hatred of Bolton overshadowed old feuds. Robb took careful count with Galbart Glover. They reached nearly 600 men, a fraction of the hosts once commanded under the banner of the Direwolf, but enough for a daring strike. More might arrive soon, Wyman's main force, perhaps a few other stragglers. The question was whether they dared wait or if they should move at once. That night, Robb conferred with the gathered lords in a makeshift command tent formed of lashed pine boughs and canvas. A rough map was spread on a tree stump. They had no skilled cartographer, only the memory of older hunts or campaigns. Galbart Glover traced a route that would bring them near Moat Cailin's southern approach, using the forest as cover until the last moment. If the stronghold was held by only a token garrison of Bolton or Ire-born soldiers, they could take it quickly. If it was stronger, they risked a siege they could not afford. Either way, the plan was to secure that pass, then ride north with haste. Some argued to bypass Moat Cailin entirely and race to Winterfell, but Robb shook his head. If we leave Moat Cailin in enemy hands, reinforcements from the south might pin us between two armies. We need to ensure the road is blocked. It's how my father always taught me, never leave a fortress at your back. They eventually agreed. One day's march would bring them close to Moat Cailin. Then they would approach at night, attempt to surprise the garrison. Word had come from a scout that the Ire-born had mostly abandoned it after Balon Greyjoy's death, but some Bolton men might be stationed there now. No one was sure how many. They had to gamble. Robb spent a final hour walking among the men, reassuring them. The wind rustled through the high pines, the sky a dark expanse of stars. Though his body still bore the scar of the red wedding's wounds, he felt more alive than he had in a long time. These were his people, weathered, battered, but unbroken. They had come, despite every terror, to restore House Stark. Jon's words from the wall echoed in his mind, if we stand together, we might hold back the dead. Indeed, for that to happen, they first had to hold back the living terrors in the form of Roose and Ramsay Bolton. At dawn, they marched. The air was crisp, the sun pale behind a veil of thin cloud. Despite the early hour, a murmur of determination ran through the ranks. They kept a loose formation, columns weaving between the trees, scouting ahead and behind. By midday, they neared the edge of the Wolfswood. Moat Cailin lay beyond a stretch of bog and low hills. Robb called a halt, sending forward scouts to assess the fortress. Word returned near dusk. A handful of Bolton banners were seen flying above the broken towers. The watchers estimated perhaps 50 men inside, maybe fewer. No sign of reinforcements. 50 men behind those walls can hold off 1,000 if we're not clever, Galbart said, brow creased. But we have advantage of surprise if we strike at night. Robb nodded. Then tonight it is. We'll form two groups, approach from east and west simultaneously. Archers will lay down covering fire. The bog might hamper us, but it also hampers them. If they see an attack from one side, the other side will be their weak point. Whispers circulated that the Boltons might have turned Moat Cailin into a charnel house. Some of the men recalled how the Ire-born had been starved out there. But no one suggested turning back. This was the first step to reclaiming the north, and they would not shy from it. Twilight came, draping the land in long shadows. Robb led the eastern group himself. Some manderly men, the Glovers, Rory, and Kennet at his side. They crossed the bog slowly, boots squelching in the mud. A fog rolled in, thick and chilling, swirling around their ankles. Ahead loomed the broken towers of Moat Cailin, ancient stones that had once guarded the neck. In the gloom, torches flickered atop the walls, revealing the silhouettes of sentries. Every so often, a shout could be heard, echoing across the marsh. Robb's heart thundered. He could sense the tension in his men, see the wide whites of their eyes in the dimness. They crept closer, halting in shallow water. The other group, led by Galbart, would be approaching from the western flank. Robb prayed to the old gods that the timing held. He signaled his archers to position themselves behind a low ridge. Then he, Rory, and a handful of the bravest swords edged forward. Once in range, Robb lifted his arm, then dropped it sharply. Arrows whistled through the air. The night exploded with shouting, the twang of bowstrings, the cries of startled sentries. Figures on the walls scrambled, returning fire with crossbows. A crossbow bolt hissed past Robb's shoulder, splashing into the bog. He pressed onward, sword in hand, urging his men to push through the shallow moat at the foot of the fortress. Arrows zipped overhead, some striking stone, some finding flesh. From the west side, more shouting erupted. Galbart's men had begun their assault. Caught between two fronts, the defenders panicked. Robb surged to the base of the ruined gatehouse. Wooden palisades had been crudely erected, but they were rotting. He and Rory crashed into them, hacking and pushing. Kennett ducked under a low beam and thrust a spear at the man behind the barricade. The Bolton soldier shrieked as the spear found his thigh. Others rushed in, swords flashing in the torchlight. Mud sucked at Robb's boots, the stench of bog and blood mingling. He parried a blow from a desperate sentry, felt the jolt up his arm, then riposted, forcing the man back. Another arrow soared overhead, burying itself in the man's shoulder. He collapsed with a strangled cry. "Forward!" Robb roared. "For the north!" His voice tore at his throat, half-choked by the reek of the marsh. More men pressed in behind him, tearing down the palisades. The defenders were outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1, but in the confined space of the narrow causeway it was a vicious scramble. Several of Robb's men fell to crossbow bolts or to swords, but the Boltons had no time to reload effectively from 2 directions. Within minutes, the battered gatehouse began to collapse under the assault. The defenders retreated deeper into the courtyard, seeking better cover among the ancient stones. Galbart's force entered from the west with a triumphant cry, cutting off any escape. Cornered, a few Bolton soldiers threw down their arms, begging for mercy. Others fought to the death, cornered like wolves with no route out. The clang of steel against steel echoed off the broken walls. Moonlight glinted on blood-slick stone. Robb advanced, ignoring the ache in his side, pushing aside a toppled timber. One last soldier rushed him with a wild swing. Robb deflected the blow, pivoted, and slashed across the man's chest. The soldier fell with a ragged gasp. Then it was over. The sudden hush rang in Robb's ears. Men panted, coughed, stumbled over the fallen. Torches guttered in the damp night air. Around them lay the bodies of Bolton men, some still moaning. Robb took stock with a grim heart. At least 20 of his own men lay dead or dying in the mud, but the fortress was theirs. Moat Cailin belonged to the wolves again, if only for a brief moment. Galbart approached, blood on his cheek. "We've secured the western tower. The rest of them are dead or surrendered. No sign of reinforcements." Robb nodded, sheathing his sword with hands still trembling from adrenaline. "We post watch immediately. Gather the prisoners, any who yield can be questioned. We'll bury our dead at first light." A ragged cheer rose among the men, the first note of exultation they'd had in a long while. Robb felt no joy in it, only a fierce sense of purpose. The gate was open. The path to Winterfell lay ahead. This victory was small, overshadowed by the far greater challenge. But it was a beginning. He closed his eyes, remembering all those lost. This was for them. They spent the rest of the night fortifying the broken walls as best they could. Work crews cleared debris, used planks to reinforce precarious walkways. Meanwhile, some men scouted the perimeter, searching for signs of any Bolton rider who might have escaped. It seemed none had. Rory helped patch up wounds, his big hands surprisingly gentle with bandages. Kennett prowled around the courtyard, ensuring no one had slipped away to raise the alarm. Come dawn, Robb stood atop a crumbling tower, gazing southward over the bog. The horizon lay gray and distant under a cold sky. If any Bolton force marched from further south, they would see Moat Cailin's gate manned by new faces. That alone might deter them or force them to waste time. Meanwhile, Robb's main objective was north. He turned, looking the other way toward the direction of Winterfell. The castle was still days away, but it loomed in his imagination like a half-forgotten memory of home. He heard footsteps behind him, Galbart Glover. The older man joined him at the tower's edge, eyeing the bleak landscape. "We lost good men tonight," Galbart said quietly. "But they fought knowing it was for something bigger." "What next, my lord?" Robb inhaled the damp air, tasting the tang of marsh. "We hold here just long enough for the rest of our allies to catch up. Then we push on Winterfell. If the gods are kind, Roose Bolton isn't there. Ramsay might be. And if we can end Ramsay, the North will rally faster. No one wants the bastard on the loose." Galbart nodded. "And if Roose does come south from the Drefort? Then we meet him on the field. I'd rather face him in open battle than let him pick us off in small skirmishes. If Harry Karstark sees that we've taken Moat Cailin, maybe he'll change his tune. We'll send ravens if we can find a maester's rookery here." Galbart grunted, casting a glance at the half-toppled tower to the west. "Maester's tower was destroyed, I fear. We'll have to rely on riders." Robb sighed. "Another complication. But so it went. We'll adapt. We have no choice." He gave Galbart's shoulder a light squeeze, then descended the winding steps. The courtyard below buzzed with the subdued energy of men cleaning up after the battle. Some hammered makeshift repairs. Others gathered bodies, both friend and foe. A pair of archers stood watch on the broken parapets, scanning for any movement in the marsh. Robb spied Rory by the battered gate, speaking with a group of Glover men. As Robb approached, he caught snippets of their conversation: which bodies needed burying, where to dig the trenches in this waterlogged ground, how to salvage crossbow bolts. Rory turned at Robb's arrival, bowing his head in respect. "My lord, they want to burn the Bolton bodies. We can't dig deep here, and the men don't want them fouling the water." Robb's lips pressed together. "Agreed. We burn them. Let the smoke tell the realm that the flayed man no longer rules this place." Thus, they set about the grim business. By noon, pyres were lit on the far side of the bog, black smoke rising into the iron-gray sky. Robb stood with the others, silent as the stench of burning flesh wafted over them. The image of the Freys and Boltons at the red wedding flickered through his memory. He felt no pity for the men who had raised Bolton's banner, but a twinge of sadness lingered for the cycle of death that seemed endless. Afterward, he gathered the others in the courtyard for a short speech. The men listened, weary but hopeful. Robb tried to keep it simple. "Tonight we rest. We make final repairs. In 2 days we march north. Winterfell awaits. You fought bravely here. Fight just as bravely again, and we will reclaim our home. The old gods watch us." A ragged cheer followed. Robb's gaze swept across them. They were no shining, disciplined army. They wore mismatched armor, carried battered shields. Many still nursed minor wounds from last night's fight, but their eyes shone with a fierce light he recognized from the early days of the war, when the North had risen to avenge Ned Stark. Perhaps that same spirit could still prevail. That evening, as the sun sank into a haze, Kenneth approached Robb with a captive in tow. A Bolton soldier, young, with a gaunt face. The soldier's arm was wrapped in a blood-stained bandage, and he stared at Robb with a mixture of fear and hate. Kenneth cleared his throat. "He's one of those who surrendered. Says he has news, but only if he can speak to you directly. We've kept him under guard." Robb studied the prisoner. "Very well. Speak." The Bolton man wet his cracked lips. "I was forced to join Bolton. My family, they threatened. I never wanted to fight you." He swallowed. "We heard rumors that Robb Stark was alive, but everyone said it was a ghost story. Then you showed up at Moat Cailin. The rumors are true." Robb's tone was cold. "Get to your point. What news?" The soldier glanced at Kenneth's drawn dagger, then back at Robb. "Ramsay Snow, Ramsay Bolton now. He's at Winterfell, but word is that Lord Roose has gone to Barrowton, trying to gather more men. Ramsay commands maybe 200 men at the castle, plus some Sellswords. He's taken in stray mercenaries, cutthroats, to bolster his numbers. They're brutal, half-feral. Ramsay encourages them. He does terrible things." Robb felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Ramsay was at Winterfell and Roose was elsewhere. A window of opportunity indeed. "You're certain?" "Yes. I served in the retinue that left the Dreadfort for Moat Cailin, but was stationed here when Ramsay moved on Winterfell. He wants to claim the Stark seat to prove himself to his father." The soldier's voice shook. "Please, my lord. I only want to see my family again." Robb studied him with narrowed eyes. He could sense the man's fear was genuine, though that did not prove his innocence. "You'll remain under guard. If you speak truth, you may live to see your family. If you lie, you'll die here. Am I clear?" The soldier nodded fervently, tears in his eyes. Kenneth led him away. Robb sighed. So Ramsay commanded only 200 men, albeit vicious. That might be enough to hold the half-ruined castle if the walls were secure. But if Robb arrived with a force near 1,000, the odds favored him. Ramsay's cruelty would count for little against determined northern lords. He found Galbart Glover, shared the captive's words, and together they prepared for the next move. They would leave in 2 days, marching north with all haste. Wyman Manderly's contingent should meet them in the field if the timing aligned. From there, it would be a straight push on Winterfell. They must take the castle swiftly, or at least besiege it before Roose could return with reinforcements. Every moment counted. As the days passed, more trickled in. Lord Wyman arrived with 100 men. Fewer than Robb had hoped, but enough to matter. He brought wagons of supplies and a few horses. He greeted Robb with an embrace, ignoring the stench of the bog. "We had to slip past several watchers on the road, but we made it. The rest of my men remain behind, to protect White Harbor in case Bolton seeks revenge there. Robb nodded his understanding. "You've done more than enough, my lord. Now we finish what we started." On the morning they marched from Moat Cailin, the sky was overcast, threatening snow. The men advanced in somber columns across the neck, bypassing smaller hamlets or outposts. They encountered minimal resistance. Some scattered outlaws easily brushed aside. By the third day of marching, the chill in the air had intensified, and the first snow began to fall in fits. The roads grew treacherous, but the men pressed on, urged by the dream of retaking Winterfell. The knowledge that Ramsay awaited them with only 200 cutthroats spurred them forward. The final push came at dusk on the 5th day out of Moat Cailin. Their scouts returned, breathless, to announce that Winterfell lay just a few miles ahead. Smoke curled from the castle's chimneys, the walls partially repaired but still showing scars of burning. The lead scout had counted at least a dozen watchers on the battlements, more patrolling the courtyard. They carried the flayed man banner. No sign of pitched tents outside. Ramsay was not expecting a siege, it seemed. Robb assembled his captains in a shallow dell, sheltered from view by a rise of land. Snow fell in lazy drifts, speckling hair and cloaks. The day's light was fading. He considered waiting until morning for an assault in full daylight, but the risk that Ramsay might spot them overnight and rally was too great. Surprise was their best weapon. If they seized the gates, forced entry before Ramsay could barricade the place, victory might come swiftly. Attack at nightfall, Robb decided. We'll send a small group up first, quietly, to eliminate any guards who stand watch outside. Then the main host charges. If we can smash the gates, we're inside before they know what hit them. Some lords exchanged anxious looks. Winterfell was not just a fortress, but a symbol. If they damaged it further, it would be a bitter tragedy. Yet none questioned the plan. They had come too far to shrink away. The old seat of House Stark must be reclaimed even if it cost more blood. They readied in the falling snow. Torches were doused, men checked weapons by the faint gray light. Robb paced along the line, offering quiet words of courage. Some recognized him from earlier battles, nodding in solemn camaraderie. Others were too young to remember the war's beginning, gazing at him with awe as if in the presence of a living legend. Each face reminded him of what he'd lost and what they now stood to regain. At last, as night fell in earnest, they crept closer. Winterfell's walls loomed, dark and broken in places, newly repaired in others. Torchlight glowed from within, hinting at movement. A swirl of wind carried the faint scent of smoke and roasting meat. Ramsay's men were likely feasting, or else tormenting some poor souls. Robb's blood chilled at the thought. The vanguard moved first, a handful of archers and swords creeping to the outer gate. The watchers above had grown lax, trusting in the isolation of Winterfell. Arrows whistled, dropping 2 sentries before they could raise the alarm. A brief startled shout rang out, cut short by another arrow. Then Galbart's group rushed the gate, hacking at the half-reinforced wood. Robb was right behind them, sword in hand, hard hammering. The sound of splintering timber echoed into the night. An alarm finally went up inside. Torches flared on the walls. Shouts resounded through the courtyard. But it was too late. The gate cracked under the onslaught of axes and a battering ram improvised from a log. Robb saw men atop the battlements hastily firing crossbows. He ducked behind a shield, felt a bolt ricochet with a clang. The next moment, the gate gave way. Northern men poured through, brandishing steel, bellowing for House Stark. Inside, the courtyard was chaos. Ramsay's men scrambled from the hall, some half-drunk, some more disciplined. They formed a ragged defense near the stables. Dogs barked madly. Robb rushed forward, his men spreading out to flank the defenders. The swirl of battle was a nightmare of sparks and shouts. Snow churned underfoot, turning red with blood. The battered walls of Winterfell reverberated with the ciel. Amor. Robb cut down one mercenary who lunged at him with a spiked mace. Another tried to flank him, but Rory darted in, shield raised, taking the blow. Robb slashed, feeling the jolt in his wounded side. Pain flared, but he pressed on, refusing to yield. Each breath was a ragged gulp of freezing air. He saw torches flung into the stables, the straw catching fire. Horses screamed. The defenders were desperate, no sense of discipline. Some of them broke and ran deeper into the castle's interior. "We have them," Galbart cried, rallying men to chase the fleeing mercenaries. More poured into the courtyard from outside, overwhelming the outnumbered defenders. Yet amid the chaos, Robb remembered the real target, Ramsay. He fought his way toward the great keep. The corridors there were half-burned from Theon's siege years ago, the walls black with soot. Shadows flickered in torchlight. He stepped over broken furniture, splintered doors. Shouts and steel rang from side passages as smaller fights broke out. A dying mercenary spat curses at him, then slumped. A dog trotted past, baring its teeth, before a manderly soldier cut it down. The air reeked of blood and char. A shriek echoed from around a corner. Robb turned just in time to see a figure dart away. A woman or a young girl, chased by one of Ramsay's men. Robb was torn. Chase them or find Ramsay? He roared at a pair of his own men to follow the corridor and protect whomever was fleeing. He pressed on, searching for the hall that led to Ned Stark's old solar, a place Ramsay might hole up in for a last stand. Or perhaps he'd be in the great hall, twisted enough to meet Robb face to face. He emerged into a half-collapsed gallery that overlooked the main hall. Torchlight below revealed a brutal melee, some of Robb's men battling half a dozen sellswords. Corpses littered the floor. The dais once graced by the Stark high seat was in disrepair, but a single tall chair stood there, an ugly mockery, draped with a flayed man banner. Robb felt a surge of fury. Where was Ramsay? Suddenly, laughter echoed in the high rafters. Robb whirled, sword raised. From a shadowed archway atop the gallery stepped Ramsay himself, clad in dark leathers, a twisted grin on his pale face. Blood spattered his sleeves. In one hand, he clutched a short sword. In the other, a cruel-looking dagger. His eyes gleamed with the madness that had made him infamous. "So the little wolf returns," Ramsay said, voice echoing in the vaulted space. "I heard rumors you were dead. This is a fine surprise." Robb steadied his blade, stepping carefully over the wreckage. "I've come to reclaim my home, and to end you." Ramsay's grin widened, grotesque. "Your home? So sorry, but it's mine now. Father gave it to me as a reward for flaying your rebel bannermen. And I do so love new toys." Robb felt the old rage coil in his chest, fueled by every story he'd heard of Ramsay's atrocities. "Your father's betrayals cost the North its honor. You disgrace it further with every breath." Ramsay's eyes flickered. "Honor? Boring. But your father had it, didn't he? It got him killed. Let's see if it gets you killed too." He lunged. Robb parried, feeling the shock jar his arms. Ramsay was fast, faster than Robb expected. The bastard hammered him with a flurry of blows, laughing whenever Robb blocked. Robb staggered on the uneven floor, the pain in his side roaring. He grit his teeth, forced himself to focus on technique. This was not the chaotic swirl of the courtyard, but a deadly dance. One misstep fatal. Ramsay's dagger slashed at Robb's thigh, slicing through cloth but missing the flesh by a hair. Robb riposted with a backhand blow. Ramsay twisted aside, laughing. The two circled, panting, steam rising in the cold air. Below them, the din of battle continued, men shrieking and steel clashing. Here in the gallery, it was as though time slowed. Robb feinted high, then cut low. Ramsay caught the blade on his dagger, though the force nearly wrenched it from his grip. Robb pressed the advantage, slamming forward with a shoulder check. Ramsay reeled, barely regaining balance before hurling a vicious slash that tore a shallow line across Robb's forearm. Blood welled, hot against the chill. Robb hissed, ignoring the pain, driving forward again. Ramsay retreated, eyes blazing, grin fading slightly. "You fight better than I thought a corpse would." His next attack was ferocious, trying to force Robb back against the broken banister that overlooked the hall. Sparks flew as their blades rang together. A slip on the debris nearly cost Robb his balance, but he managed to sidestep a thrust. He struck at Ramsay's ribs and the blade bit flesh. Ramsay let out a feral snarl, staggering back. Blood stained his leather. Anger twisted his features. "You'll pay for that." Robb's breath was ragged, his side afire, arm bleeding. But he had no illusions. Either he killed Ramsay now or the bastard would do worse to him. "You've made the North suffer enough," Robb spat. "No more." They clashed again. Ramsay's blade slid across Robb's shoulder, opening a searing cut. Robb roared, chopping downward. Ramsay blocked the strike with dagger and sword crossed, but the impact forced him to a knee. Robb slammed his pommel forward, catching Ramsay in the temple. The bastard cried out, stumbling. Robb seized the moment, hacking at his exposed flank. Ramsay twisted, taking a deep wound across his back. He howled, a guttural sound of pain and hate, and dropped to one hand, breath-hitching. Robb stood over him, sword raised. Blood dripped from both men. Ramsay coughed, spattering the floor. "Kill me if you must," he snarled, "but you'll never be free of me. Father will come. You can't fight the Lannisters forever. They'll flay you. They'll—" Robb swung, burying his blade in Ramsay's chest. The bastard's words choked off in a gurgle. His eyes widened in horror and disbelief. Then, with a final rattling breath, Ramsay Bolton collapsed in a heap, blood pooling around him. Robb yanked his sword free, trembling with exertion. It was done. The bastard of Bolton was dead. He stumbled back, leaning against a broken pillar, trying to catch his breath. Waves of pain rippled through his wounds. He pressed a hand to his bleeding arm, eyes locked on Ramsay's corpse. How many nightmares had the North suffered at that man's hands? It felt impossible that he now lay silent. Shouts from below reminded Robb that the fight was not over everywhere. But as he finally descended the stairs into the great hall, he saw that the remaining defenders were either cornered or surrendering. Manderly and Glover men had the situation in hand. It was a brutal, bloody victory, but a victory nonetheless. Kenneth and Rory rushed to his side, eyes widening at his injuries, but Robb waved them off. "I'm alive," he panted. "See to the wounded. Secure the castle." The men nodded, and a cheer began to swell as word spread through the hall. "Ramsay is dead. The Starks have taken Winterfell." A triumphant roar built, echoing off the old stone. Robb let it wash over him, feeling tears prick his eyes. Winterfell was theirs once more. The traitors' hold on the seat of House Stark had been broken. That night, battered men carrying the banners of Manderly, Glover, Serwyn, and others stood in the courtyard, raising torches high, hailing Robb Stark as their rightful lord once again. Some cried, some sang half-forgotten northern chants. Robb, still drenched in blood, was too weary for ceremony. He only gazed at the broken towers, remembering his father's voice. "This is your home. It must always be defended." They found no sign of Rickon or Bran, no sign of Theon Greyjoy, though rumors suggested Theon had been taken to the Dread Fort long ago. They did find a handful of terrified prisoners, servants, stable boys, battered villagers that Ramsay had taken captive. Robb ordered them freed, fed, and tended. The castle was in shambles, half-burned or crudely rebuilt. But it was Winterfell. It still stood. And with it, the possibility of reuniting the North under Stark rule. When the morning sun finally rose, it cast a pale winter light upon the courtyard. Snow drifted from the sky, dusting the blackened walls and half-ruined towers. The battered gates now bore the sigils of the houses that had reclaimed it. No longer did the flayed man flutter overhead. Instead, an old Stark banner, tattered from the days of Ned's rule, was hung above the keep. A gray direwolf on a field of white. Robb gazed up at it, a lump forming in his throat. He stood near the broken well, bandages wrapped around his arm and torso. He felt each breath as a struggle, the wounds from his duel with Ramsay burning. But he was alive. Surviving that bastard felt like avenging every horror the North had endured. The men around him carried out repairs, gathered the dead, made plans to guard the walls. For now, they had staved off the immediate threat. But Roose Bolton was still at large, and the realm's wars were not over. And beyond it all, the White Walkers gathered in the far north, a threat greater than any mortal foe. Yet in that moment, the feeling of sunlight on his face, the sight of the direwolf banner, and the knowledge that Winterfell was once again in Stark hands gave Robb a glimmer of peace he had thought forever lost at the Twins. He reached out and steadied himself on the rim of the well, gazing around at the courtyard where he and Jon had once sparred as boys. Memories flooded in. The laughter of his siblings, the stern but loving presence of his father, the warmth of a home that had felt eternal. He closed his eyes, letting a single tear roll down his cheek. Perhaps that old life could never be fully restored, but at least he had reclaimed these stones from those who had dishonored them. He would hold Winterfell until Jon Snow could come south, until the lords of the North rallied, until the specter of the dead required them all to stand as one. That was the vow he had made, both to the memory of his father and to his brother at the wall. Amid the bustle of repairs and the hush of the winter wind, Robb Stark felt the ghosts of the past settle around him. He imagined Caitlyn's gentle hand on his shoulder, guiding him. He pictured gray wind padding across the yard. He heard Ned's voice whisper that justice had been served, that the house was reclaimed. The road ahead was fraught with dangers: Roose Bolton, the Iron Throne, the possibility of the Lannisters descending, the unstoppable force of the White Walkers. But for the first time since the Red Wedding, Robb believed that there was a future for the North and for House Stark. In the sky overhead, the snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, a silent promise that winter was coming indeed. Yet within these walls, a battered wolf had returned, and with him came the fierce determination that the living would not yield to the cold or to the dark. Winterfell's heart still beat, and House Stark's fire still burned. If the entire realm needed that fire to keep out the endless night, then so be it. Robb would see it done. He was a son of Ned Stark, and he would stand against all that threatened the living, betrayer or other, Frey or White Walker, until his very last breath. And in that resolve lay the North's best hope. The wounded wolf was home, and the dead would face more than they had bargained for. House Stark would answer the call, and the North would rise once more.